If I said,
package.
should Joe Biden bomb Moscow? Yes or no? What would your answer be to that question? My answer is no.
I guess I would. I mean, that. Maybe here's a better way of putting it. Okay.
Really? Come
Hold
on,
on,
that was
let me
so
go.
easy. So
Okay. Yeah.
I went to Ukraine. I'm a big supporter of Ukraine. I've spent a lot of my time, doing some aid work to Ukraine. I am a big supporter of American military and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, and I think we should continue to do it until Ukraine hopefully wins this war or gets the best settlement it possibly can. That's my position. What is yours?
Can I just ask you real quick? When you say you were involved in aid, can you what kind of aid? Did that include any kind of military aid, security aid, or was it purely like humanitarian type? With
Technically,
aid with food
it
or
depends.
clothing and that kind of thing.
It depends. Some of it was like body armor. One of it,
Okay.
one of it was kind of like an ATV. It's kind of unrelated, but it was like an ATV. I
Right.
also paid for gasoline to deliver Starlink to the front.
Okay.
So stuff like that.
My position on Ukraine aid, and I do think aid is kind of a misnomer because it kind of has a connotation of a first aid kit or something. Just the word aid, when it doesn't encompass, just in terms of its like lexical connotation, what the quote unquote aid actually is in this context, which is like heavy artillery and rocket systems and stuff. So I tend to do scare quotes when I say the word aid, so you have to forgive me if I
let me be clear. I am in favor. I'm in favor of lethal
I got it.
aid. Lethal
I
aid.
got it.
Aid that
I got
kills
it.
soldiers. Okay, clear. Want to be clear.
I got it. Well, first off, my starting point with U.S. foreign policy across the board is one of just foundational skepticism, of not accepting, not reflexive skepticism, in that I'm going to be skeptical of everything in this, perfunctory way, or in this just knee-jerk way for its own sake, because I want to be a contrarian. But because I think, epistemically, the most fruitful posture one can take toward U.S. foreign policy in particular, but also with regard to other subjects, but let's just focus on this for now, is one of just kind of foundational skepticism, meaning I'm not going to accept premises at face value. Assertions need to be substantiated by evidence before I'm going to accept them. And I'm also very cognizant of the history of U.S. foreign policy. And I'm not trying to do a what about Iraq thing, which is like the most cheap, oversimplified version of this argument. I'm simply noting that if you're at all aware, and if you've done any basic study, and I've even done some journalism on this stuff now, because I've been in the field for, I guess, around 12 years. I'm not saying I'm like Cy Hirsch or anything, but enough that I'm somewhat acquainted with these patterns of how the U.S. policymaking apparatus works. I know that very commonly, almost you could say ubiquitously, U.S. foreign policy objectives, initiatives, interventions, they're not presented to the public in a fully forthright manner. The nature of the commitment that must be made on account of these interventions is not bluntly disclosed to the American public ahead of time. In other words, there's lots of deception and chicanery and lots of ill effects associated with U.S. military interventions throughout the years and decades, okay? So that, for better or worse, that's the same posture as I would have taken toward Syria or Libya or Iraq or Afghanistan or whatever. I take in that sort of like foundational first principle sense to Ukraine, okay? So that's the first thing. So I'm more looking at it from, and I don't want to come across as pompous, maybe it's unavoidable. I'm looking at it really first and foremost from an empirical standpoint, from a journalistic standpoint, from the standpoint of what is the reality of this policy? How does that potentially conflict or contrast with how the policy is being presented to the taxpayers and the voters and the constituents of these members of Congress who are voting on the war appropriations bills? Does the logic add up in terms of how the intervention is being justified? Because I actually do make a habit of calling U.S. policy in Ukraine at this point an intervention of sorts. Not that there's a full deployment of like the 81st
We're
division or
involved, but our
something
soldiers
on the
aren't
ground.
fighting, basically.
Sorry.
We're
Well,
involved,
yeah,
but our
but
soldiers aren't fighting.
well, I mean, it's pretty much established at this point that there is a pretty robust special operations force in Ukraine, although we don't have great insight into what they're up to or what authorizations they have, but that's been
Probably like
reported and pretty well
assassinations.
established.
Probably nothing more than what the Soviet Union probably did in Vietnam. Probably around the
Well,
same
I mean,
length and the same.
I don't know, I'm not going to speculate. It probably, let's just not speculate on that.
Yeah. I
The
mean,
point is, it's an intervention. It's an intervention because it's a giant armament transfer program. There's also operational coordination between the U.S. military and the Ukraine military in terms of the combat operations. There's, on top of that, the U.S. is almost singularly funding and organizing the war effort. Not to say I'm not taking anything away from the Ukraine military on the ground. Clearly, there are some pretty tenacious fighters in that military. Okay, I acknowledge that 100%. Saying that the United States is fundamentally the prime mover in the military context in Ukraine because it's without American support as like the decisive variable. Who's to say how any of this would have unfolded, right? And it's also, by the way, basically just funding and subsidizing the Ukraine state for non-military purposes. The U.S. is basically paying Ukraine state workers salaries and pensions right now. Okay, so it's nation building, more or less, which everybody kind of claimed at one point that they were disillusioned with in terms of U.S. foreign policy objectives. But now we're back on it, and the term has magically disappeared. Wow. So I don't want to answer. I don't want to come across as evading your question or not answering it directly because I know that I'm going to get accused of that. But all I can do is genuinely tell you what my view is. My view on this issue has never been from like that kind of binary yes or no moral judgment standpoint. Is it good to send the weapons or bad? That's just not really what I'm interested in. I'm not like interested in doing a moralistic assessment in that sense. However, yes, I am skeptical from all the standpoints I just articulated about the nature of the policy. I think that I'm critical of the policy from the perspective of trying to highlight when the logic underlying it doesn't add up or when certain ramifications of it are not being adequately highlighted. So that's my basic posture. The U.S. has now sent more security aid, so to say, to Ukraine than it has to any country in a single calendar year since South Vietnam. So during the Vietnam War, it's a huge military and resource commitment that the U.S. has undertaken. The intertwining of the combat operations are profound at this point, and it has, of course, all kinds of wider reverberations about in terms of U.S. foreign policy, even in other domains. So, yeah, my basic position is that I am going to continue to be, as I have for as long as I've been aware of U.S. foreign policy from like a standpoint of a critical thinking citizen, my foundational premise is going to be skepticism toward official claims, skepticism about the veracity of how the ramifications of the policy are being depicted, skepticism as to the manner in which funds are being appropriated and the weapons are being distributed, and so on and so forth. If that doesn't kind of crystallize into a crisp yes or no answer on like a normative level about my feeling overall on the war, so be it. But that's my answer. It's like this. Okay. It's pretty much just this almost ideological skepticism that some people might interpret as contrarianism or grifting or something. But really, it's a reflection of what I authentically think.
Okay, can I give you what I believe? Somebody went over there and I'm not using that the virtue signal, but like from my experiences, what I believe.
Right.
I believe that it is a priority for the United States to continue to send aid to Ukraine. And I think Biden has done a relatively okay job. The only criticisms I have for him is areas where I don't think he went far enough with, say, longer
Right.
range missiles or earlier intelligence support to Ukraine. I think a lot of these failures, though, were the fault of the intelligence apparatus, which did not have enough human intelligence in locations within the Russian military or on the ground, which meant we were able to like predict when they were invade because we had amazing technical intelligence, but we weren't good at predicting, say, like how corrupt this officer was who commands this officer corps. Like we couldn't have predicted a lot of the Russian military failures, and I think a lot of the early failures are down to that. But when it comes to the dynamics of this war, I believe fundamentally that at basically every single place where the Russians could have escalated this war or brought it to like a higher level or this conflict generally, they have chosen the path of escalation over the other option, which they could have chosen. And this one made almost the least amount of sense if you have all the cards on the table. My retelling of Ukrainian history is like this at this angle. In 2014, Viktor Yanukovych, after promising on the campaign trail that he was going to, stay in he was going to enter the association agreement, giving a lot of Ukrainians the opportunity to have like visa-free travel in Europe, be able to go throughout Europe and operate, labor regulations that would have helped Ukrainian workers. At the last moment, after Vladimir Putin used economic coercion by stopping Ukrainian trucks shipping goods into Russia from allowing them to pass, which that's like 25% of Ukraine's trade. That's like a massive amount of part of it. After he was confronted by Putin, he turned around and said, never mind, I'm not going to do the association agreement. I'm going to do what Putin says, since he, was basically stopping all trade with Ukraine if they to go through that. It's economic coercion, which Russia had promised it wouldn't do in the Budapest Memorandum. Then protesters came out on the street. They protested against us, saying, hey, I want visa-free travel to Europe. You promised us you would do this. You need to fulfill this promise. Then those protesters were brutalized by the Berkut mostly, which is a special police force that engaged in, a lot of racketeering, a lot of torture, very corrupt. Ukraine has a massive corruption problem. And Tatushki, which are like these kind of like armed, they're basically thugs that the government will like give a small amount of money to go beat up somebody they don't like. This is how a lot of like governments operate, very sadly. After the brutalization happened, the protests became bigger, and they became more than just, hey, this is about the association agreement. Now it became about Viktor Yanukovych's time in power. It became about police brutality. It became about corruption and the association agreement. And after over 100 protesters were murdered by the government and countless negotiations, Viktor Yanukovych flees the country after the last round of negotiations fail. After he leaves, they host an election and they're trying to elect a new person. But during that process, Russia invades Crimea while lying about the whole time that they're invading Crimea. They're like, hey, we're entering Crimea. Well, they never even said they're entering Crimea. They were just denied it the whole time. And then they started funneling a ton of weapons to rebels in the Donbass and putting in troops, even if they didn't have Russian markings. And
Can I quickly interject something for 2 seconds? Because you're going on sort of a winding relitigation or recapitulation of recent Ukraine history. I just want to make clear, and I'm happy for you to do it. I actually find it interesting to hear it from your perspective. But I just want to clarify that none of what I say in terms of U.S. policy, either on this stream, on Twitter, on Substack, or anywhere else, ought to be construed or is intended to be construed as any kind of affirmative defense of Russia. I mean, I know I'm accused of that 24/7 till the cows come home online. Nothing I can really do about it, sadly. But in terms of what my own conscious thoughts are, that's never been an intent. So I don't know if you're kind of recapitulating this history as like a pre-rebuttal for the expectation I'm going to mount this, rousing apologetics defense of Russia, but that's not what I'm intending to do.
I'm more trying to justify why I think we should send weapons, right?
Okay.
Because I'm taking a strong stance that we should send weapons. If not, we should send more weapons, right? And like, obviously, if I'm going to ask people to like spend their taxpayer dollars, even though the majority of Americans agree with me, 66% from the last poll I saw, that we should be sending these weapons to Ukraine, I should give them like a background or a history. We can skip through that, and I can basically just say, if we would have continued to go through this, at every single opportunity, Russia pushed it forward. They pushed it forward in 2014 when they invaded and annexed Crimea and put troops in the Donbass and funded the Donbass. They pushed it forward when they were trying to do the economic coercion before that. They pushed it forward when they said they were going to do training operations on the border, lied, and then invaded the country on February 24th. They pushed it forward when they went back on the promises of the Budapest Memorandum. And I guess for me, at every single opportunity, Russia has made the decision to escalate this conflict to where it is now. And so I believe that war is largely the fault of Russia, and that Ukraine is a nation state reforming their democracy to try to make it better and better after having many shaky years after the Euromaidan revolution. And they're trying to defend it from another country invading, and being quite explicit in the idea that Ukraineness is not real. It's a disease of the mind, is the exact word that Dmitry Medvedev used. And now they're trying to annex large swaths of territory illegally. And I think this should be stopped for many reasons. One reason is I think it causes instability throughout Europe and the world, and it's a bad precedent to set. I think it's bad because it's had a massive humanitarian and negative effect on Ukraine, with the amount of civilians who have died, dumped in mass graves, war crime, accusations of rape, which are pretty gruesome. I think it's bad because it's caused a lot of economic chaos. And I also think it's bad because Russia is trying to start a new international precedent when it comes to threats around nuclear weapons. This idea that you can invade a country, make a bunch of nuclear threats, and then everyone's just supposed to cede to your demands. Could you imagine if we invaded Vietnam, and after invading Vietnam, like Nixon would have just said, after like the 10th year where we're getting our ass kicked, we say, you know what? Maybe we'll just blow it up. Maybe we'll just use a nuke and we'll wipe Vietnam off the face of the planet. MacArthur was rightfully removed from his position for proposing such a thing in Korea. But the Russians kind of like make this threat very like evidently, like very often. And I think that's something you can't secede to, because that'll encourage that behavior in other states. Say North Korea, Iran, Israel, Pakistan, India. They'll get the idea that you can invade a country, just threaten to blow up the world, and then you win. And that's a terrible, terrible thing to encourage. I think Ukraine is in the morally correct position. I think it's better for international precedent if we stop Russia where it is. And I think, honestly, that it's beneficial for the whole world if Ukraine wins this, because I do think it would set the correct precedent.
Okay, let me just ask you real quickly.
Yeah.
What would have to be achieved for you to say, okay, no more U.S. aid is necessary? The objective, like the overarching objective that I desire to achieve has hereby been achieved. I guess victory has been obtained. What has to happen for you to make that statement, hypothetically?
There's
because like I'm trying to, because otherwise like if there's no criteria set out.
I can give you criteria right now.
Okay, yeah, I'm not saying you don't have criteria.
Okay.
But at least if you look at U.S. policy now, as it's presented by the Biden administration, members of Congress, even in the media, it's a limitless U.S. intervention, right? It's a quote unquote perpetual war. That was the very thing that was supposed to have fallen out of fashion, just a couple years ago on a bipartisan basis, because both Republicans and Democrats increasingly recognize that these perpetual expenditures of taxpayer money on all kinds of conflicts around the world was not the most prudent use of resources, et cetera, et cetera. So, okay. So yeah. So that,
okay. You want my guidance?
I guess, that's my question to you. Like, what is the point at which it can be concluded that U.S. aid has achieved its purpose?
I think there's two scenarios. The first scenario is there are no more Russian soldiers within Ukraine. They've been kicked out, and I define Ukraine as its internationally recognized borders, and or a settlement has been reached that guarantees long-term European security. And so what I don't mean is some ceasefire that kicks the can down the road that is used as a delaying tactic, or just means that this war will just catch back up in 5-10 years from now, where there's no security agreements, but like a deal where we know that Ukraine was in a protective structure that'll stop it from being invaded again. And that there was that negotiated settlement. That, of course, I would like to see Russia out of Ukraine under that scenario as well. But those are, I would say, be the two scenarios I would point to where we're like, okay, I think we can probably wind this down, and any aid moving forward will probably be the civil society groups or NGOs.
Okay, so you differ somewhat then from certain Ukraine government officials and, social media influencers. I'm not even trying to be derogatory when I put it that way. I'm not exactly sure how to even describe them, but it's a commonly held view that the only acceptable outcome, or like the only acceptable criteria for when it would be, justly declared that, okay, United States, the aid has served its purpose. You can pack it in. Is when is for the when the first scenario that you articulated is achieved, right? So the full expulsion of Russia from all of territorial Ukraine as defined by, like, I guess it's the 1992 borders, right? So that would include Crimea, and I'm not sure to what extent it would necessarily include, the Luhansk and Donetsk. It's kind of left a bit more unclear, but Crimea is probably the more
They want all their international
incendiary
recognized
sort of
borders.
dimension of that. Although I guess it's arguable. So you
I can-
sort of
I
differ.
can-
You differ from people who would insist on scenario one and not entertain scenario two unless and until scenario one is achieved.
So my thing is, right now Ukraine has exceeded every expectation of its military performance, and we should basically assist them as they continue to exceed expectations, hopefully. And I think that Ukraine should use every tool in its power to try to achieve the reclaiming of Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, and the rest of Kherson through military means. And if they cannot achieve that, and it's literally there's no they've tried all their options, they've tried offensive, they've tried marine landings, they've tried the whole thing, and they've just found it not to be the case, then you could have some type of Korean War situation where you have to do a negotiated settlement. But I do agree with Douglas MacArthur that when you enter a war, you don't enter a war to be second best. You don't enter a war to get a maybe negotiated settlement. You enter a war to win. And I agree that we should fight. Wait, let me finish. Yeah. That the Ukrainians should fight to win. And so far, with that in mind, they've achieved great things that nobody could have seen coming. The recapturing of Lyman so short after its fall, the offensive on Kupiansk around Kharkiv, the reclaiming of the only provincial capital the Russians have captured in Kherson, and pushing them over the river. Russian logistics are in chaos. Russian training operations are in chaos. The Russian bear has been humbled. And so for me, I think we should try to win, try to have Ukraine win. And if that has been shown to be physically impossible, then you have no choice but to negotiate. But that negotiation should not lead to a scenario where we just kick this down the road and give Russia another opportunity to invade, because this is the best chance Ukraine has at victory.
Wait, okay. So if a negotiated settlement includes Russia maintaining jurisdiction over certain parts of Ukraine territory, is that a tenable settlement? Can you conceive of that being a tenable settlement if it has that condition?
When you say tenable, what do you mean? I don't think it's
acceptable. I mean, could you imagine yourself?
I would say it's not acceptable, but sometimes strategic reality makes the unacceptable acceptable. Okay. You get what I'm saying? Right now,
so it's not inconceivable that there could be a scenario where you would be compelled to accept that settlement.
It's not inconceivable, but that situation should be avoided at all costs at this point. And once we've gotten to a situation where that's unavoidable, unless we want a full-blown World War III nuclear explosion, then at that point you might have no choice. But the thing is, I think right now we do have the choice. Because right now, Ukraine's acting extremely successfully. They've used the munitions very effectively, and I think we should support them until they can get the best deal possible, which hopefully is the expulsion of all Russian troops from Ukrainian territory.
Okay. Actually, that MacArthur quote you cited, and I couldn't recite that quote off the top of my head, but so I'm assuming that it's you're roughly correct in your recitation of it. That's a great illustration of why I take the posture that I do, right? So MacArthur is probably speaking truthfully for his own purposes, that when you enter a war, you want to win the war. I mean, that's just common sense, right? But the United States is a co-combatant in the war. The United States is singularly funding, arming, operationally coordinating the war effort. Even when they talk about, hold on,
we're the majority, but we're not singularly doing it. We're the majority. There's certain roles we can't serve, with tanks, for example, that the Poles, Estonians, Latvians picked up.
Well, even the tank transfers, that is organized by the United States ultimately. So even if the tanks themselves aren't
the main leader, but I don't.
The United States.
They're the main
the United States is the United States is organizing the arms supply operation through which the tanks will ultimately be transited into Ukraine. So when I say singularly funding and operationally coordinating and arming, I'm not saying that literally every armament originates in the United States, but the United States is the prime mover
Yeah, we're the leader.
militarily, organizationally.
Yeah.
Um,
We're
and
we're the leading aid supplier and coordinator.
right, and even the aid that's not directly supplied by the U.S. is facilitating and organizing the transfer of
Yeah.
those other countries' aid. Right, it's the U.S. is running the operation, on the periphery of Ukraine, particularly in Poland, that is the kind of command structure and the nerve center for this whole operation. I went to Poland myself. I don't know if you're aware of this. When the war started, I mean, I got criticized for all kinds of wacky angles, including that I didn't go into Ukraine, even though that wasn't my intent. I mean, not that I was going to begrudge anyone who did go into Ukraine, but my whole purpose was I wanted to kind of, to the best of my ability, assess the nature of the American sort of arms transfer operation as it was concentrated in Ukraine, or sorry, in Poland on the border region. So I spent, a couple weeks there, and I talked to Pentagon personnel and all kinds of people. So I'm not saying I have the most comprehensive understanding of the nature of this mission of anyone on Earth, but I've at least I've tried to do my own investigation and research to the best of my ability. Even just this last week, I was in D.C. I went to 2 defense industry conferences where I spoke to Pentagon officials and members of Congress, and so I try to do some due diligence to kind of bolster my understanding of the nature of this U.S. military intervention, and I think it's the magnitude of it is chronically undersold to the American public, because Douglas MacArthur had it right in terms of him sort of distilling the attitudes that are operative in wartime contexts. When the U.S. intervened in this war in February, and I'm writing a piece on this, it's unfortunately delayed. I wish I could have finished it before we had this talk, because then you could have seen it more tangibly. But when the intervention was first launched in February, when the war started, right, it was presented by Biden, by Antony Blinken, by members of Congress, and so forth, as kind of a limited aid mission, right? They stressed the humanitarian aid that was being given. They used the word aid over and over again. There was no notion presented when the intervention started, meaning the arms transfer operation once Russia invaded on February 24th. Once that whole U.S. effort started, it was never presented to the American people as this open-ended military intervention that was going to supersede the nature of the U.S. military commitment to South Vietnam in the Vietnam War years. Because that's striking.
I have an explanation for that.
As of September. So now we have another appropriations supplemental that's apparently going through Congress for December. But as of this September, sorry, what?
Beautiful, ain't it a beautiful thing?
Well, I guess some might view it that way. But even as of September, okay, so the last round of appropriations, which actually kind of smudged into this other budgetary bill, Ukraine had already surpassed South Vietnam in terms of outlays from the United States for quote unquote military aid. And so, I mean, that's a striking commitment. That's a striking devotion of resources. I think there are also risks attached to that, as demonstrated by Joe Biden himself, the commander in chief, making a point to go in public on multiple occasions and warn that the United States and the world is closer to, quote, nuclear Armageddon, Joe Biden's phrase, not mine, than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. There are people who, I don't want to name names, but there are prominent Ukraine types who are pretty vociferous about their views on this whole issue, who were saying in the weeks before Biden made that comment in early October that even to suggest that the level of nuclear risk that faces the world vis-a-vis Ukraine is anywhere comparable to 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis, that's Russian propaganda. That's helping Russia. That's doing their PR for them, and that's all part of this
can we
You know,
break this down
campaign
one at a
to like
time?
to spook the
Can we,
outside funders and the war. Okay, so
can I?
but let me just wrap up the point.
Okay,
In
but
a
it
couple
has to
more
be wrapped up
sentences.
because there's a lot of things you said there. I have like three, four things I
Okay,
need to respond to.
okay. Let me just complete the thought. I mean, I promise I'll be quick.
Okay.
So when MacArthur says that you enter a war to win it, I agree that that is kind of inextricably what the philosophy is going to be when the U.S. enters an intervention, as it did in February. And my argument is that the limited aid mission that was suggested to the American public was going to be the basically full extent of this intervention has now transformed into what you just advocated, which is the U.S. is leading this offensive to retake Crimea. And I say leading in that the U.S. will be operationally coordinating and funding and arming whatever Ukraine military offensive comes about vis-a-vis Crimea or anything else for the foreseeable future. So that's mission creep on a massive scale. That's greatly increased risk, nuclear and otherwise, on a vast scale. That's all kinds of economic ramifications through sanctions and what have you that weren't conveyed to the public. So yeah, that taken in totality, and we could go all day naming other factors that are relevant here. Taken in totality, I think it's more than warranted for one's kind of foundational posture toward the nature of this military intervention to not just be like this reflexive, yes, it's good, no, it's bad thing that is kind of a cheap distillation of the whole matter into like a superficial way of characterizing it. Okay. But this foundational skepticism about the details of the U.S. military commitment, how it's actually working in practice, and so on and so forth. Because I think there's inarguable evidence of, at the very least, mission creep of the kind I just described. Okay. And that's consistent with U.S. foreign policy throughout the ages. So
I'm forgetting my points.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. So the first point I would make is I think it's impossible to compare the American aid program in Ukraine to the American operations and aid programs to the South Vietnamese government. I think the main difference would be
only comparing it quantitatively in terms of
let me finish.
Yeah.
Okay. Because you're not letting me explain why I think it's incomparable, so you don't know what my criticism is yet. Okay. The problem is with comparing this is in Vietnam we had soldiers on the ground. We had our own tanks, we had our own divisions, we had our own soldiers fighting and dying. And so a lot of the resources that we would have provided Vietnam if South Vietnamese government, if we weren't deployed there, we didn't have to provide that aid because we performed many of the functions that the South Vietnamese couldn't do. For example, if we were, let's say we had a modern Vietnam War and we were over there, we would bring our own HIMARS. We wouldn't send them HIMARS in an aid package because we could just bring them ourselves and use them for ourselves. And so that's the first reason I think it's incomparable, is because the nature of these missions were different, where every single piece of support we give to Ukraine has to be delivered through some sort of aid package, where every single piece of support we provide Vietnam could just be the American military going and performing that function. And so that's why you're going to see a massive difference in aid. And also there is 50 years of inflation that needs to be accounted for as well.
Well, I'm accounting for inflation in this comparison. Okay. This is not my comparison. This was in the New York Times.
Yes.
So, I mean, you could say that the New York Times made a comparison that is unwarranted, but that's where it comes from.
Yes, I'm saying the New York Times made a silly comparison, and I don't understand why they would make the comparison. If you wanted to compare, you would have to compare this to say, like, well, I mean, maybe like the support we gave the Soviet Union while fighting the Nazis, or you'd have to give it to something where we didn't have troops on the ground performing functions. We had to send the support to do it. So I don't think we could really compare it to Vietnam. The second thing I would say when it comes to this idea of like, oh, we had no idea what we were selling the American people. As of the first week or two of the war, we thought Ukraine was going to collapse. The American government thought it. The French government, every government thought it. Most international monitors and defense people that I knew thought it. I thought it. You probably thought it. Basically, everybody thought. Well, then you're like, I didn't
know what to think. I mean, I know that's the kind of the sort of common narrative that everybody thought Ukraine was going to collapse. I don't know where they got that information. It seems like it came from the CIA or something. I'm not even saying that to be conspiratorial. That's probably where it came from. And I'm not convinced that was ever. I mean, I don't know why it is that the CIA allegedly getting its forecast wrong somehow became this like overarching narrative
I can tell
scene setter that we're supposed to judge everything in relation to, because
Well,
war
it's
is
not
very
that.
unpredictable. War is very chaotic.
Uh-huh.
So, I mean, at that point, once the war started, I thought, I don't know what to make of this. I'm just going to do
So
what I did before the midterms and try to just expect the unexpected.
that's good. That's happy that you did that, but the vast majority of people didn't. Because people saw it as Russia, the great Russia, who easily took Crimea before, is now invading all of Ukraine proper with the might of its military. This is supposed to be the second most powerful nation on the planet, with the second most powerful military, depending on your view of the Chinese military, fighting Ukraine, who back in 2014 didn't put up a tremendous defense of Crimea. They put up no defense at all. Putin thought, and he was wrong in thinking this, that basically you could kick down the door of Ukraine and the whole rotten thing would like collapse to the ground. This fake Ukrainian idea would collapse. That wasn't the case. But the United States thought that. Most people thought that. So originally, for the first week or two, like when these offers were being made on like getting people out of the country, and we were talking about like evacuations, and we were evacuating our embassy, the reason we weren't talking about this massive military aid is we didn't think in like a month to 2 months that our military aid would have an impact, because we thought the government was going to collapse. We thought that the Russian military was going to win, and we thought that the sending of HIMARS would do nothing but basically be gifting Russia free HIMARS that they would immediately take. And it was that failure of human intelligence that didn't know how corrupt the Russian military was and how much there was a will to fight in Ukraine that led to us not getting vital aid to Ukraine that they needed a lot sooner. And so my criticism of that early time would have been our failure of our intelligence agencies to properly diagnose what the situation in Ukraine was going to be, and therefore sending that aid sooner. And so I would say I don't think that was like a lie by the Biden administration or some purposeful thing. I think it was as the situation changed and the experts changed their analysis, the nature of our support changed, because we realized, holy shit, we can win this thing. When at first we were just like, who can we scrape out of this country before they get put on a wall, was like our original thoughts about it. That's why we talked about humanitarian aid so much at the start, is because we don't care if the Russians capture a fucking some bandages. We care if they capture a HIMAR.
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm not accusing anyone in particular of lying. I think that's kind of an over dramatic or even unilluminating way to phrase what I'm trying to express here about how the war was initially presented to the American public, right? So, I mean, you might temper your language or you might frame things in a certain way, and that tempering and framing might not most accurately depict reality, but are you lying, so to say? Not necessarily. So that's kind of a sort of a almost a non sequitur that I think people might get hung up on, because then you have to litigate, is it a lie or is it not, which is not really what my point was. Just a side note, you say, the U.S. was trying to evacuate people from Ukraine in that early stage of the war. I don't know if you saw this, but a couple of weeks ago, or maybe a month ago now, or maybe even a month and a half, the New Yorker had an article that was one of the very rare and commendable, but still rare examples of the media doing something that resembles actual journalism on this war and on the U.S. policy in Ukraine, where it detailed the intimate operational coordination between the U.S. and Ukraine in combat operations, where real-time intelligence is integral as fed by the U.S. into these Ukraine missile systems and whatnot that lead directly, within nanoseconds to shells being fired at Russian formations, and huge, large numbers of casualties. There was even one point where they said that there was an incident, I think it was in June, where as many as 100 Russian soldiers were killed in one incident, and the U.S. was the one basically operationally coordinating that combat offensive. So anyway, in that article, they said it was reported that the line that became this folklore and this rallying cry, where Zelensky was supposedly offered an opportunity to evacuate to wherever by the U.S., but he says, "I don't need to ride any need ammunition." I mean, that was basically a confabulated propaganda line that was seeded into the discourse. Understandably enough, it was hugely effective. It was hugely kind of galvanizing, and so I don't blame them. I don't blame them from the standpoint of propaganda. But anyway,
wait. To be clear, when you said that was completely confabulated, The offer, as far as I know, was real. It's a question of whether the quote that he responded that way, what's being questioned on whether that was just propaganda or not.
All right, but I mean, the reason why that quote went viral, I mean, I have to reread the passage to just get the exact wording, but the reason why that quote went
I don't
viral
need
and
a
became
ride,
this
I
like
need ammunition.
marquee, yeah, because it's, a catchy, spicy line that lends itself to like virality and to galvanizing and to, kind of raising the enthusiasms of the pro-Ukraine supporters. So, I mean, I get it in terms of its effective propaganda, but it's propaganda nevertheless, as is much of the information that goes across the,
But
stratosphere
can
in
we quickly
on the internet on this war.
as an
Um,
American, though, right after Afghanistan, the fact that he stayed was a big thing for me. And I think the reason why is we saw after 20 or how many Americans died. And that's a much bigger commitment in my mind when we have Americans dying in Afghanistan, coming home in coffins. We had so many Americans die, so many locals die after 20 years of fighting. And Ashraf Ghani, we hadn't even left the country yet. And he already is filling up briefcases, allegedly with cash, getting on a plane and fleeing. We didn't see that same behavior from Zelensky, and I do think that behavior is commendable.
yeah, okay, yeah. I didn't mean to dwell on that side note. That was
Okay,
just sort of
it's
that
just
was just
I think as an American, I think
that
you
was
would
just a point
share
of
that.
information.
It's like a big
Um,
difference. I think that's a big reason why a lot of Americans like support Ukraine and didn't
okay,
support staying in Afghanistan was because like we saw the will to fight in Ukraine that we did not see in the ANA, particularly at the same levels.
Okay, let me just, before I lose my train of thought, let me just respond to the thrust of what I wanted to respond to that you said. Um, so you said that, because everybody got it wrong, Ukraine was actually much more militarily resourceful than anyone had anticipated, and Russia was incompetent, and so on and so forth. Just I'm not sold on that being like the proper framing for the issue because again, it seems to have originated with the CIA, these predictions, so to say, that Ukraine was going to fold within a matter of days or whatever. Who knows what the impetus for the promulgation of that supposed prediction was? Again, I'm not claiming anything one way or another. I'm just saying there's some weird uncertainties around that whole narrative that was kind of constructed after the fact. But whatever the reason that the nature and scope and intensity of the U.S. military commitment in Ukraine drastically expanded after the intervention was launched. Whatever the reason why that happened, it happened. It happened soon after the war was launched. By June, basically, the United States was fielding direct requests from the Russian Defense Ministry to essentially furnish Ukraine an entire new military. So not just send a couple of javelins and some, MREs for people to eat, in a war scenario, but to furnish them an entire new military in the middle of a war. Now, of course, the U.S. doesn't have probably the capacity to accede fully to that request in June of 2022, but they're coming pretty darn close as time goes on. And so, even if you think it's warranted, right, for the scope of the mission to have expanded so drastically, it still expanded, right? So it reinforces the fundamentally skeptical posture that I've tried to convey that I took from the outset and continue to adhere to. Because, like so many other military interventions in the past, it turns out that the Ukraine is not the first one in history that actually proceeded on the trajectory that policymakers claimed it would proceed on from the outset. Rather, it expanded almost overnight. Just one example quickly. In early March, Adam Smith, who's a congressman from Washington State, chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, he said that there couldn't be any real-time intelligence sharing for Ukraine combat operations because that would cross a line and bring the U.S. directly into the war. So Adam Smith said that couldn't happen. That was going way too far. Then, within a week, we find out, of course, that is what was going on. And now it's just accepted as, a law of nature that the U.S. is going to be involved on that kind of intensely intimate operational level and even going well further. So it's stuff like that. It all adds up to the point where now we're in this momentum. We're like in this kind of, avalanche, snowball rolling down the mountain avalanche situation where the ball keeps building up and accumulating snow, and eventually the snowball is going to get to be unrecognizable compared to how big the snowball was told to us was going to be when the war started. That's kind of a weird metaphor to use, but you get the idea.
I get the idea.
So yeah, I mean, this idea now that we're all like supposed to be cheerleaders for an offense. I mean, this is a defensive. This is a strictly defensive war. They would use the bogus term defensive aid as if there was ever some kind of like neat conceptual distinction between offensive weapons and defensive. There wasn't. I mean, that was nonsensical. But then, by April, they kind of just, or May, they forget, they stop bothering to even attempt to make that distinction. It goes on and on and on to now where, although it was initially a purely defensive U.S. military intervention, right? Just defending against Russian aggression. Now we're all supposed to be cheerleaders for going on the offense in Crimea. Yes. I know that that Crimea was Ukraine territory as of 2014. Not contesting that. I'm simply observing that a military offensive to militarily seize Crimea was not contemplated as within the orbit of defensive operations that the U.S. was going to get involved in February.
Okay.
It's because there's been massive mission creep. There's been this inertia and momentum, as is almost ineluctably the case with U.S. military interventions, that got to the point where the U.S. is now integrated into these far more maximalist goals than had been seriously communicated to the public earlier on. I mean, the idea that even the U.S. would be in a position where it was facing down a nuclear threat akin to the Cuban Missile Crisis, as told to us by the president. That is also a radical expansion of the scope of this commitment that was in no way communicated or even predicted in February. Rather,
so
whenever Biden would talk about it, he would always try to downplay the severity of it.
Separate notes here. I have I have 10 things I have to respond.
I got you. Yeah, I'll leave it there for now.
Okay.
And I'm so okay. Yeah, let's try to go. I mean, can we maybe say 10, 15, 20 more minutes, something in that range?
Yeah. I just want. Okay, we won't add anything new to the list, but I want to address what has already been said.
Okay, gotcha.
Right?
Gotcha.
So the first thing I want to address is like the prediction of immediate collapse. It wasn't just the CIA that thought it. It was the FSB who thought it. It was all, like, as far as I know, all major intelligence organizations had a general idea that Ukraine would not be able to withstand an invasion of this size. If it wasn't that fact, then Russia, if the FSB believed something different, then Putin wouldn't have launched this invasion in the first place if he knew it was going to be this much of a disaster for him. So I don't think it's just like the CIA made bad predictions. It was a complete failure amongst multiple intelligence agencies apart across multiple countries and multiple defense experts and quote unquote experts. On the first day, the Russians were making like extreme claims like we disabled 100% of the Ukrainian Air Force, right? They were trying to make up for the fact that immediate collapse that they predicted, they needed to have media to say, hey, it is collapsing. But at the same time, that reality just didn't match what they thought was going to happen. So I don't think it's just the CIA that caused this. I think it was a complete failure upon the intelligence community generally across multiple countries and military experts just working with incomplete information, just like Vladimir Putin was when he made the decision to invade. If he knew Ukraine would perform this well and it would been this much of a disaster, I don't think he ever would have launched the invasion in the first place. That's the first thing.
Impossible to say, but yeah.
Yeah, but I'm just kind of like making a prediction there, but like who knows for sure. Second than that, like the idea that we furnished an entirely new Ukrainian military.
No, that was requested. That was requested by, Zelensky's chief advisor, I think Yermak, if I'm not mistaken, in June. So I'm not saying that was immediately furnished once it was requested, but that ended up becoming the scope of what was being requested on the part of the U.S. Not just a sprinkling of javelins and small arms, but like pretty much
Ukrainians
furnishing an entirely new military.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's understandable that as Ukraine's being invaded, they're going to ask for as much as they can possibly.
Oh, I understand
get.
it. I'm not saying it's not understandable.
But to be clear, if I think we probably both know a little bit about the negotiations. A lot of the things that Zelensky asked for, he didn't end up getting. He didn't get the long range missiles. He didn't get the MiG fighter imports. He didn't get a lot of the things that he ended up
Burns is
asking
an
for. And I
immoral,
think this is
morally
Biden
corrupt,
trying to play
bankrupt
some
man.
some amount of like balancing the wire of making sure to keep Ukraine in the fight and enough to win, while also not doing too much to provoke the Russians. Personally, I even disagree with a few of the things that he's held back on, like the long range missiles. I'm a big supporter of that. I think it would decimate Russian logistics in the south. But so I would also say though, you keep bringing up this idea that like, well, you know, as this war continued, it's had a lot of creep, and now like this discussion about this war, like I don't think a lot of people realize how much aid we're giving, and like we signed up for something we kind of like didn't really think we were signing up for. I would say that like it is true that the situation has changed and now we're giving more aid, but as the situation has changed, Americans have become even more supportive of sending military aid to Ukraine, especially after Ukrainian victories. Four
Well, I don't
months
know about that.
4 months ago, it was 53% of Americans supported aid to Ukraine, military aid. The last, I think it was 2 months ago, like 2 months following, this was after the successful offensive on Kharkiv, that number jumped 13 points to 66%. And
It's
so
down
for
from the
me,
peak in March, though, right?
it's still, well, of course, immediately after the invasion, when there's the most coverage is when there's going to be the most support. But it went up, it started to go down, and then after Ukraine started to have successes, it started to go up again. Because Americans, I think, are willing to put up with this cost if they see results. If you ask Americans, hey, should we send more weapons to Afghanistan in the year 2020? Most Americans will say, of course not. Are you fucking kidding me? We've done this for 20 years and we've gotten nothing out of it. It's failing. But if you ask the same thing about Ukraine, they're going to say, well, it seems like Ukraine's won some major battles. I mean, they won Kherson, they won Kupiansk, they won this. It looks like our aid's having a tangible impact, which it is. The HIMARS are decimating Russian logistics down south. It's part of the major reasons why I think Russia had to withdraw from Kherson with basically no fight, was because they couldn't sustain those troops and the winter was going to be brutal for them. And so I think Americans
Can you,
are
can you
willing.
answer? Can you clarify something factually for me, really quickly?
Sure.
In terms of the Kherson withdrawal, and this happened during like right smack dab in the middle of the midterm, so I wasn't paying as much attention to the ins and outs of
Yeah.
what was going on tactically in Ukraine. Russia still occupies significant portions of Kherson Oblast, right?
Yes, they don't.
Okay.
The big thing that happened is they got pushed over the Dnieper River, which was a major
Right.
goal for the Ukrainians for a long time, and they lost the only provincial capital they've captured the entire war, which was the
Right.
city of Kherson, which is the
Right.
second largest city they've captured. So that's why it was a major loss. Not to mention Russia, according to them, annexed the territory. And so this is
Right.
also a big smack in the face because they did the annexation under the auspices of, man, we really lost around Kharkiv. We're going to annex to show that we're never leaving, to reinstall confidence. That was the idea. And then immediately they lose the territory they just annexed. It also happened in Lyman, which was almost like a turkey shoot of Russian soldiers. And so for me, I think Americans are winners. We're winners. We love the Ukrainian struggle. We see it's a moral struggle. And we say that this is different than Afghanistan because we're seeing tangible results. And those tangible results we see on our television screens when we see Ukrainians flying the yellow and blue out of liberated territory in Kherson, where they give testimony, like incredible testimony of like, we don't have power. They stole our stuff. They looted. I don't care if we don't have electricity. At least I'm Ukrainian again. At least we're back home. And they're revisiting families. Those tangible results where hundreds of thousands of people are liberated. We're seeing it on our television screens. And that's why I think Americans are willing to deal with this increase of cost for supporting Ukraine, is because they see the results and they see that a lot of Ukrainians seem to be fighting for values that a lot of Americans hold dear and near to their heart, like the protection of their democracy.
Oh, I would agree that part of the strategic calculus on coming from Ukraine, as far as I can infer, is that they are aware of the ability of the need to maintain popular support in the United States, and they calculate that that can be achieved by demonstrating battlefield victories. So it does seem
Which is
like
reasonable, by the way, right? That's
no, yeah,
reasonable.
it's not. It makes logical sense because if Ukraine is being depicted in the U.S. media as victorious and valorous and having these remarkable gains, then yeah, that might have some material impact on American public opinion, and maybe fortify the resolve to continue provisioning the arms. That makes perfect sense to me from a propaganda standpoint. And again, I'm using propaganda almost as a neutral term there because any party at war, whether it's Ukraine or Russia, they have a propaganda operation going. And one of the actual insights of this war that I think is not sufficiently remarked upon is that for all the overwrought warnings that we were subject to about this massive Russian interference propaganda operation where they have their tentacles and everything all over the world. They're kind of like pulling the strings because of how sophisticated they are. Well, I mean, it seems like Russia has basically been swamped by Ukraine, in conjunction with the U.S. and NATO and so forth on the public relations front. Russia's been almost pitiful in its ability to promulgate its own propaganda. But anyway, so I guess, and I'm happy to reconvene and we could do a Ukraine specific sequel to this. But I guess maybe a concluding thought.
Okay, but I still have two more questions to follow up.
Okay.
On something you said.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Okay,
yeah, that's fine.
The first thing...
no. Let me. I was going to make a thought of my own. Sorry.
Okay.
One thing that informs my basic skeptical posture, in addition to the mission creep element that I articulated, is that I think there's a whole lot of hotly contested or contestable premises associated with U.S. intervention in this war that are just kind of accepted on face value, never really probed or interrogated, and are pretty extreme if viewed in a particular light. And yet they're just kind of presented as laws of nature or like the unalterable reality of the universe, which is just ridiculous. And let me just explain to you what I mean by that. From the outset of the war, major countries in the world, India, China, I'm not defending India, China, or any other countries I'm going to list here on the merits on anything. I'm just noting what their publicly stated position has been. India, China, South Africa, Mexico, Brazil, Pakistan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Major countries, okay? They've said, you can go listen to what they say at the UN. Their position has been from the outset that what ought to be pursued is a cessation in the war. Cessation of hostilities, okay? So they want, anti-war strategies to be deployed to bring about a cessation of hostilities, at least going by their public statements. The U.S., on the other hand, from the beginning, has maintained a pro-war policy. And people get really angry when I put it that way because they think pro-war means chest thumping, George Bush with a cowboy hat or whatever. No, what I mean by that is the policy measures that have been instituted by the United States vis-a-vis this war from the outset have all been intended to facilitate and intensify, in many instances, warfare. So from the beginning where we're dispatching, where we're basically dumping without any tracking whatsoever, huge numbers of small arms into Ukraine, to then it goes to heavy artillery, and then now we're at tank transfers and longer range missile systems. I know you're saying that you quibble with Biden in that he hasn't sent long range enough missile systems, but the range keeps increasing. So given the trajectory, who knows? Maybe you'll get your wish pretty soon. All these efforts have been facilitation of warfare rather than mitigation of warfare or cessation of hostilities. Now, a lot of people who support Ukraine and wave the flag.
Okay, Michael,
and
can I just say one thing? Wait. I just need to tell you for the dialogue. I'll let you go on, but I'm not going to let you leave until we address my points too. So
okay, no, I got that. Okay, I'll stay longer. Okay. And I'll try to wrap. I'll try to be expeditious. So people who are generally pro-Ukraine think of themselves as adhering to the common perception of the nature of the Ukraine conflict ideologically, where they think, this is the hinge point of global democracy, and Ukraine is our beachhead of, the international order, and we got to defend it at all costs, and the moral dimensions of the Ukraine conflict are basically analogous to the moral dimensions of World War II, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, the mainstream position, kind of bipartisan. Maybe even there's a bit more zeal on it within, liberal or even left precincts. They don't like to think of themselves, especially the leftist and liberal factions of this support base, as pro-war, right? That's kind of gauche, right? You don't want to think of yourselves as pro-war. Who's pro-war? Who likes war? Well, I don't know. There are some psychos who like war, but forgetting them, if you support a policy measure that's expressly designed and intended to facilitate and intensify warfare, which is what the U.S. has done from virtually every angle on this war, okay? Even if it doesn't go far enough in terms of the length of how far rockets can be shot that the U.S. is sending in there with these systems for your taste. Nonetheless, it's all been war facilitation, all of it. Whereas you have major countries like China, India, South Korea, that's not South Korea, South Africa, et cetera, all the ones I listed before, Brazil, Mexico, that have been advocating for a starkly, almost diametrically different approach in that they think it would be superior to seek to bring about a cessation of the war. Actually, Turkey has had a similar posture, which, is awkward because it's in NATO and the U.S. never quite seems to know how it should handle or talk about Turkey. But, Erdogan seemingly has mediated some of these talks and the grain deal and whatnot. So I guess ultimately what I'm objecting to and what also informs my sort of resolutely skeptical posture is this idea that it's just an article of faith, or it's just, the natural laws of the universe that the U.S., of course, just, by definition or by like divine decree would be pursuing this unwavering campaign of policy measures that are designed to facilitate rather than mitigate war. If you ask me, just on principle, do I think war ought to be mitigated or facilitated and escalated? I'm generally for ceasing war and mitigating war rather than increasing the scopes of wars and furnishing those wars with ever higher caliber of armaments and so forth. And yet, because of the propaganda, and again, not using that as a pejorative, using it just as a descriptor, the propaganda campaign associated with this war, with the democracy rhetoric, all the highfalutin talk about how civilization hangs in the balance, Putin's going to do a Hitler-style blitzkrieg through the Poland and the Baltic states if we don't, stand up right now, et cetera, et cetera. All that has created a situation where it's made it such that the pro-war position, which I'm sorry, it just is descriptively, neutrally. Okay. You could say that you support the pro-war policies. That's fine. We can have that argument. That's what you're articulating. Your view is that's fine, but it is a pro-war policy, and because of this whole discursive, wormhole that we've all been sucked into on account of this war, that's the right-minded liberal position or left position, or even I guess conservative position, to be unstintingly pro-war, whatever the escalatory risks, etc. Whereas the anti-war position, or the position that tends to favor, doing bringing about, if possible, a cessation of hostilities. So the position associated with Turkey, India, China, etc. That's now, in the U.S. context, a fascist position, or a MAGA insurrectionist position, or a pro-Putin, you must be paid by the Kremlin position. And it's a total warping of the contours of the debate that ought to be had about this. And so I object to those distortive and manipulative propagandistic effects of how the war's justified. And so, that also is a significant contributing factor to my overall sort of posture on the war. And sorry for going a little too long.
Expeditious, huh?
That was not expeditious, I admit
it. Okay. So I got more points, but I do want to make sure you're out of here before midnight at the very least. There was things from the last thing I still haven't responded to.
By the way, are people watching this? Do we have an audience now?
Yes, we have an audience. Yes.
Okay. Are they sick of me? Are they?
They want you to be more quiet. Is what they seem to be expressing the most of.
Be more quiet.
Like basically that you're talking too long.
Okay. Well, in fairness, you did invite me for
yes,
a talk.
I invited you to talk. I did invite you.
But I take the point.
Yes. Um, so the first thing you said is like the defensive aid. We said it was defensive aid to kind of like misrepresent what it was, or it was offensive aid. It's being used in offensive operations. I think when people say defensive aid, that Ukraine is using it in defense of their country. And the thing is, Crimea, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, Luhansk, all of Ukraine, like that is their country, and they're defending against a Russian attack. So it is defensive aid, and the idea that this is military aid being used in a defensive war. I think when people think of offensive aid, it would be like giving like Israel aid to invade Lebanon. That would be offensive aid. I think that's how most Americans would view those two statements, because when you call it defensive aid, you're able to like kind of list this in your mind as like this is used to defend your country or in defense, instead of like in like attack. And the thing is, Crimea is still Ukrainian territory, so I could say by international standards that is still defending Ukrainian territory by taking that back. You're taking it back from an occupation force. Would you contest with that?
Um, I wouldn't contest that. I wouldn't contest your sort of your characterization of how defensive aid would probably be conceptualized by supporters of Ukraine, in that they think that just the war overall is inherently a defensive one. So even if there's a counter-offensive that is being furnished by the United States, that is not offensive in a sense that kind of contradicts the initial justification for the provision of aid as defensive.
Okay.
True.
So,
I mean, I think that's you're probably correct in characterizing it that way. I would simply state that the conflation of offensive and defensive aid, if you start out the intervention by insisting that the aid is purely defensive, common parlance would seem to indicate probably to most people that that means warding off the invading army, beating them back, and then just kind of retaining control of your city or something.
yeah.
All
of
which
Ukraine.
Okay, well, but I don't know if in January of this year, so let's say like a month before the invasion, Ukraine was requesting armaments from the United States for the express purpose of launching an offensive into Crimea. I don't think that would be generally understood to be a defensive request. Now, maybe you could put it that way, put it in the more kind of theoretical light, where because it's under the Russian presence in Ukraine, in Crimea to begin with, is illegal, etc., that it makes any incursion by Ukraine to retake the territory defensive. You could make that argument, but in the main, that wouldn't be seen as a quote defensive operation. That would be seen as a pretty
I mean, I guess
bold offensive military operation, which it still is. Yeah. So, but I think you're.
Okay, but I just
so the melding of those of the terminology.
I just want to make sure we can move on the discussion, because I don't want you to be here till midnight. I guess my main point is like, if it was France, for example, and we sent aid to France during World War II, I don't think at any point in that war, if we called that defensive aid because they're defending their country against German invasion, we wouldn't say in 1945, as we're re-entering Alsace-Lorraine, like, aha, you're retaking Alsace-Lorraine, that's an offensive up. Like, I feel like we're being a little. I feel like I just don't think this is like a scheme. I think most Americans think we're sending them. I mean, if you look at media, what's the weapons they show on TV? Javelins, artillery guns, force like 7.77 howitzers. We're playing like every time we see a Kerch Bridge explosion, like, or any explosion within territory that's outside of the 2014 like retaken territory that Russia's taken. Like I see the media cover it, so I don't think there's like a dishonest portrayal of what's happening with these weapons.
Well, no, I'm not saying it's a scheme. Again, it's more subtle than that, right? It's more subconscious than that. Like, I actually do think that Biden himself and the upper tiers of the Biden administration, they are sincere, in their convictions about like the ideological stakes that they ascribe to Ukraine. So I don't think they're deceptive in that sense in terms of the public justification, but if you knowingly frame the provision of aid as strictly defensive, that has kind of just a commonly understood extending in the public consciousness that I think did not accurately capture what the scope of the intervention would subsequently be. And one quick point on that, because you brought up an interesting
we can call it
analogy with Israel.
That?
Well, you brought up an interesting analogy, like, okay, so it wouldn't be defensive if Israel wanted arms to invade Lebanon. Well, Do you think if Israel, I mean, of course, this is hypothetical, although they did it in 2006 with U.S. at least implicit support, meaning, attack Lebanon. Um, uh, Israel always frames its military operations, no matter how offensive they appear to be in terms of the boldness of them or the assertiveness of them. They always justify them in defensive terms. It's ultimately in defense of the Jewish state or in defense of the territorial integrity of Israel
Or the defense
against,
industry,
foreign
the
threats.
Ministry of
So,
Defense is usually the idea. Yeah.
okay, well, but I guess my point is there are very permeable boundaries always, pretty much for everyone. Even Russia says its war in Ukraine is defensive, right? Which is, ridiculous on the substance, probably. But that nonetheless, that's the justification that they publicly cite.
Mm-hmm.
So the boundaries between what is offensive and what is defensive are extremely permeable. Even the Iraq War in 2003, but the invasion of Iraq, that was presented on defensive grounds because the U.S. was at threat by Saddam reconstituting a nuclear program or constituting one. And so, I'm not saying, Ukraine is the same as Iraq, okay? I'm simply saying that these definitional boundaries are, basically collapsed because they're always invoked simply to justify whatever military action or whatever war commitment people in power want to commit themselves to. But I think, the choice of language actually is important when a war is launched, because if it's thought just kind of implicit in just of a general sense that the war is strictly a defensive one, that sounds just kind of inherently more justifiable and reasonable, right?
Well, in a defensive war, offensives are fought. No matter what, this is a defensive war because all of this is territory Russia has invaded. It's just within defensive wars, you conduct offensives. Like it was a defensive war for a lot of nations that have and they've conducted offensives back. Like it was a defensive war when Poland fought against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union invaded them, and they did do offensives to retake territory that was taken by the Soviet Union in the 1920s. That's still classified by every major historian as a defensive war on behalf of the Poles, even if they conducted offensives to push them out of their country.
Maybe so. Maybe it's classified that way. Let me ask you. Maybe this can kind of
okay. I do want to move on because there's so many other points. But hold on.
So many... Yeah. No,
I'm
very quickly.
Keep
very
you here
quickly.
all night though.
I'll stay on all night. It's fine.
Okay.
Let me just ask you very quickly. Okay. So let's say I don't know this to be true. I can't substantiate it factually. I'm just painting a hypothetical picture. Okay. Let's say today you could hold a fair plebiscite or a referendum in Crimea. So not one that was under coercion or where people were under duress when they're voting, but like a legitimate vote that reflects in some true sense the will of the residents of Crimea. If a majority of them today wished, as expressed by their vote, to remain part of Russia, and I'm not saying that's definitely the case, I don't know, but let's say that were the case. Let's say, I don't know, 65% of Crimeans would vote in this hypothetical plebiscite to remain part of Russia rather than to reintegrate into Ukraine. Would an offensive into Crimea then still be, quote, defensive in your mind, even if could be demonstrated to be contrary to the expressed will of a majority of the citizens in that region?
It would still, well, by definition, it would still be a defensive war because they still invaded to take it. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean an offensive war can't ever be justified. There are multiple offensive wars that are absolutely justifiable. I would say the American offensive against, the fucking Confederates is absolutely justifiable. Like, there's a million offensive wars that we could say that are justifiable.
I just don't buy the category distinction. I think it's always very commingled.
So you were sorry. What was the question again? You've kind of the Crimea. Let me talk about Crimea a bit, and then we can move on to these other things. So under the scenario you just drew, my answer would be yes. That should be done under certain conditions, because the problem is Russia would never agree to the conditions that would ever make this fair. And let me explain. First off, it would have to be a legitimate referendum, so there would be no ballot stuffing, and it would be monitored by international.
I stipulated that.
Some respect, but there's also one thing. displaced people have to also be able to participate, because in the last
Sure.
8 years, a lot of people have been forced off their land. And if you look at a lot of these referendums that happened in, say, Kherson, it was done without the participation of anyone displaced, meaning
Right.
that if you were forced from your home during the war, you now don't get a say in what happens to your home, what happens to your community. And under those conditions, if they were able to include displaced people, and it was monitored by international monitors, and that fear of like Russia's gonna like shoot you in the back of the head if you do the wrong thing, if that was gone, then I would agree to it. Problem is, we also live in the real world, and the odds of something like that happening is very rare. Russia had the opportunity to do it in 2014, but they chose not to, and they hosted a pretty like obviously rigged referendum. Just like,
Well, that's why I stipulated that this is a hypothetical, because maybe it's practically impossible to actually conduct a fair referendum. I would think
it's hard to do these during war, period, because it's just like it's a war zone. It's like,
and I was on a YouTube thing with I guess you would call more pro-Russia people. They invited me on, and they were shocked because they thought that I was like a imposter because I started arguing positions that they thought they perceived as anti-Russia, in part because I was questioning whether it could just be blithely concluded that those referendums that took place in Kherson and Zaporizhia and the Luhansk and Donetsk were actually legitimate. I mean, I actually don't think that
it's
they
crazy
meet
that
any credible criteria that could lend one to believe that they were legitimate expressions of popular will. That's what I'm saying. Hypothetically, if that could happen in Ukraine, by whatever conditions are necessary to bring that about, would it? And let's say 65%. Again, I'm just throwing a number out. 65% of Crimeans in the legitimate hypothetical referendum say that they want to remain part of Russia,
including displaced people.
Including displaced people, including anybody who would need to participate to make the referendum legitimate.
At that point,
would an offensive then still be defensive in your mind to retake Crimea and integrate it into the Ukraine government?
It would still be defensive, but that doesn't mean it's morally justifiable, because that territory was still taken in like an offensive operation and a basically undeclared war for 8 years, right? Like there could be something that let's say that like all of people in Tijuana, Mexico wanted to be part of the United States. It can be morally justifiable that we invade and take it under some specific circumstance we could craft up. But at no point would I say that's a defensive war, because we still didn't, we were the one who invaded Mexico. We were the one who did the whole thing. Like, it was offensive. You can maybe say we were defending the rights of the local, but it was an offensive war. I want to go on to these, God, there's so many points. The thing about the Cuban Missile Crisis and Joe Biden's statement about Armageddon, I think that statement was stupid. I don't know why he said, I'll say it was a Herschel Walker moment. I don't know why he said that.
Maybe he genuinely believes it.
If he does, I feel it's like, it's
why
possible.
Would he? Why would he lie about that?
Well, I can give you an idea.
Sorry,
it could be true that it's technically accurate, but like that's like saying that like there's no other thing that's comparable to it. But the nuclear missile crisis is still up here when it came to the risk, and this conflict is still like down here. It's just everything else was just down here. Do you get what I'm saying? We're not like here or we're not here. We're still like way down here. And I think him saying the statement like he did with Armageddon vastly gave too much, I think, air to this idea that like nuclear war is around the corner, or that it's even particularly likely in the scenario. It's actually an extremely unlikely scenario, and it wouldn't even make sense for the Russians to engage in this. If you believe Vladimir Putin at all to be a rational actor in the slightest, I find it hard to believe that he would ever use a nuclear weapon. I think the fear here has mostly been played up by mainstream media.
I have no idea what Biden's incentive would be to like unjustifiably play up that fear, because it's totally contrary to his ostensible interest, which is why actually his statement probably has more validity, because it's against interest, right? It's against interest for him to say that this, apocalyptic scenario is actually increased to such an extent in its likelihood, because, that's seen as somehow advantaging Putin and discouraging continued provision of aid to Ukraine and whatnot. So that he made an admission against interest underscores why it would probably be warranted to view it as actually reflecting his genuine beliefs. Now, and when you say that, you think that the risk is so astronomically low, it's not even worth making the comparison. Well, I mean, even if, again, throwing numbers out here just to illustrate the point, but let's say the risk of nuclear Armageddon during the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis was, 40%, and now it's 5 or 10%. Although the risk for the Cuban Missile Crisis was greater, it's still worth drawing attention to now that there's a 5 or 10% risk, even if it's substantially
I
lower than the Cuban Missile Crisis risk. That said, Leon Panetta, who is the defense secretary and CIA director under Obama, worked closely with Biden, clearly is in communication with Biden administration officials, and is kind of like one of these sort of de facto spokespeople in the media as a former official that kind of reflects Biden administration thinking and policy with like David Petraeus and others do this
Mhm.
pretty regularly. Leon Panetta, look it up, wrote a Politico op-ed in October where he
Mhm.
said that the risk of nuclear war in Ukraine is 25%, highest as high as 1 in 4.
Well,
Okay,
how do you even get to a
or
number
one
like
in
that?
5. Well, I mean that's his prediction. I mean, who knows why?
Well,
But
I
Leon
would say
Panetta
he's
is far from
probably
a Russian
wrong.
stooge, right?
Yeah,
Leon Panetta
but
is very
okay.
fervent in supporting the Ukraine
But
position.
as
So
you know, Michael Tracey, you don't have to be a Russian stooge to necessarily be deluded about Russia, like many people were when it came to the hacking of election machines. So I think that somebody can be not a Russian stooge and still let the fear grab a hold of them, like many did when it came to Russian interference in the 2016 election, which I know you agree with that. So I do believe that this guy could be wrong. And in fact, I would make the case that both Biden, I think the Armageddon quote was wrong, but I understand why he's doing it. He wants to portray Putin in kind of this madman look. He's making all these nuclear threats left and right. But can I make the argument to soothe you, in fact, to make you think, you know what? I'm pretty confident there isn't going to be a nuclear war. I'm about to hopefully relieve you of the stress that you must be trying to relieve, like at local massage parlors and nail salons every time as we see the radiation coming over the horizon. So the first thing I would say is there isn't much to be gained out of a nuclear strike. And if he's going to break precedent like this and going to get all the consequences that come with it, it doesn't make sense if it doesn't get you anything. And so the use of 1 or 2 tactical warheads is going to have no strategic impact on the war moving forward. It'll probably have the most effect as a terror weapon. Most analysts seem to agree with this, that it could kill a lot of civilians, have a ton of environmental damage, but it's not really going to shift the front line. There might be a scenario, this is still incredibly unlikely, that they try to use it to stabilize the front line if their front line is literally collapsing. But the odds of that happening, oh no, I disconnected. I disconnected, Michael.
yeah,
This is the election interference. This is it. It's
okay,
right here. Okay. Where was I? I was
I'm back.
making
Yeah,
a statement.
or you're back.
I'm back. I was being election interfered by the Russians. Where were we?
Uh,
I was trying to soothe your
why? What you're trying to soothe me by giving an explanation for why it would be
yeah. So
irrational for Putin to use nuclear weapons. I guess maybe a way to crystallize the point is
well,
like, let me just ask you this: I mean, if you had to assign a numerical value to the likelihood that there could be nuclear use at this point, what would it be? Like on a scale of 1 to 100, like you have to give like a
it's
percentage chance
impossible.
that it could
But if you
happen.
put a gun to my head, I would maybe say like 3, maybe
Okay.
4. Like the thing is, it doesn't gain him anything. It doesn't achieve anything outside of him being diplomatically isolated, possibly getting the Chinese and Indians to actually agree to a price cap on Russian energy imports, because the Indians don't want there to be a nuclear war because of Pakistan, and Pakistan doesn't want there to be a nuclear war. The use of these nuclear weapons is a taboo to be broken because of India. China doesn't want it because they're terrified of a refugee crisis that could come from North Korea if North Korea was to actually pull the trigger on a nuclear weapon on South Korea and then a war on the Korean Peninsula. China doesn't necessarily want to take over South Korea, but they certainly don't want a war on the Korean Peninsula, which would cause a refugee crisis and could see American, at the end of the day, American bases on the Chinese border. Like basically every single nuclear armed state and every single nation of influence does not want Russia to break this taboo because of what this could mean for them down the road when it comes to international relations and normalizing the use of nuclear weapons in conflicts against them, or possibly making it so if they have a diplomatic confrontation, say with Pakistan in the future, it could get more violent than before because this has been normalized. And so there's going to be a lot of diplomatic isolation and economic repercussions, not only in probably forcing nations like Hungary to actually sign on to sanctions, and more Russian banks being kicked out of Western markets, and the price cap actually being put through on energy imports, but it's going to be probably a massive spike in aid to Ukraine in response to anything like this, humanitarian, radiological, and military. Because now the question is no longer about, hey, do we get Ukraine to get off its territory? It's, hey, do we allow nation states to engage in nuclear terror without repercussions? Do we allow this new precedent on the use of nuclear weapons to be established around the globe? And this is something that India and China, and the vast majority of nuclear states, besides maybe North Korea, they don't want that. They don't want it at all. Israel doesn't want it. Nobody wants it. And so that's why I don't understand why they would do something that would, at the end of the day, probably end with Ukraine getting more humanitarian aid, more economic aid, more military aid, and there being more sanctions on Russia and possibly agreed to price caps. And not to mention fundamentally changing the international view and dynamics of this war. It just doesn't make sense because they get nothing out of it beside the use of terror weapons. It basically becomes a terror weapon. And as we can see from the drones on electricity and the use of terror so far in this war, it has not been effective in making the Ukrainians submit. And I doubt this would be either. I think the Russians have considered it, but I think each time they come to the same conclusion. Using a nuclear weapon would be a disaster and one of the few things that it could actually bring down the Putin regime.
Well, I mean, you make a plausible case that it would be irrational for nuclear weapons to be used, and it would be detrimental to Russia's interest to use them rather than advantageous. I guess my inclination on that whole projection is that it's fundamentally speculative. I mean, it's fundamentally just weighing of different probabilities about future outcomes. And I don't have a crystal ball. I don't have tarot cards, and neither do you. I mean, as plausible as your
Are you
case
sure?
was, all I can do is look at what has actually happened that can be evaluated in real time in terms of like what's on the record. I do know that both Ukraine and Russia, as the war has protracted, which is foreseeable that this would happen, that both sides have adopted increasingly maximalist, at least rhetoric in terms of how they express their goals. As my understanding is that Russia has not eased one bit on the fundamental goals that it has expressed for the so-called special military operation. And anything, it's expanded them because it's starting in September. It adopted in explicit terms, at least Putin did. The annexation and of territory, whereas that was not explicitly articulated, at least early on. And similarly with Ukraine, Crimea was not contemplated in the public rhetoric early on as one of the ultimate objectives to bring about, triumph for Ukraine in the war, and now it is very explicitly declared to be the objective. So there's the goals are becoming more and more maximalist, both on both sides in this what seems to be an irreconcilable way. And so, could there be some state of affairs in 6 months where, although we're saying now in November of 2022 that it seems irrational for Putin to ever use nuclear weapons, that he thinks that Russia is genuinely at existential risk if it were to lose the war, which Putin has said. I mean, if you read his speech from September, he is starkly framing the war in very vivid existential terms, meaning basically the fate of Russia hinges on whether it wins in Ukraine, because it's, he views it as a, proxy conflict with the United States and the West, right? So Russia is existentially at risk if it does not prevail in Ukraine. That's basically the MO of Putin and the Russian brass, as far as can be gleaned from their public statements. Obviously, I can't read his mind, rather. And so I'm not comforted much by you putting out this argument, or anyone putting out this argument, because I've heard variations of the argument you expressed in other venues. I'm not comforted by that because, I'm not certain at all that what I would perceive as rational is what Putin would perceive as rational or within his own self-interests, right? So I don't know. It's hard for me to say with any degree of certainty whatsoever that we're operating within the same kind of epistemic framework in terms of how we evaluate rational decision making. So,
So
um,
I would
as the
just.
war drags on, but so like if as the war continues,
Mhm.
the risk is still. I mean, even if it's 3%, as you sort of postulated, that's gonna remain the risk. Even 3% seems pretty high to me, frankly, for a nuclear apocalypse. I guess maybe I would just ask you. I mean, would you grant that it's possible, maybe even plausible, that when Biden made that comment about nuclear apocalypse, he actually made it at least twice that I'm aware of. When he repeatedly made that statement, do you think it's possible that it wasn't just because Biden had this ulterior motive of depicting Putin for as a madman on like some kind of strategic ground, or that Biden was like fearful and was gripped by fear and just in a emotional spasm decided to make this statement? Do
I
you think
don't
it's at least possible
I don't think it was
that
like
it
an
was
I
just
don't
a genuine reflection of his view of the nature of the risk at the moment?
I do think it's possible. I don't think it would be accurate, but I think it's possible. I mean, like when he talks about like Armageddon and when he talks about the highest risk since the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, that's true, but again, we're on a sliding scale here. And I think the most obvious example that I could point to is Biden says one thing. What does the government do? They haven't changed their nuclear stance at all
Exactly,
since the
which
start
is
of this war,
paradoxical.
which for me makes it feel like that seems very unofficial. I think if we really were to see an attack like this happen or to lead up to an attack, we would see explicit, and this is what I think most analysts seem to agree to, most nuclear brinkmanship actors, whatever you want to call them, the people who study this stuff, seem to agree that before a strike like this would actually take place, two things would happen. One, the United States would change its nuclear stance. That's the bare minimum. Two, and this is the big thing,
Which it doesn't
Russia,
publicly announce.
Russia, yeah, but it hasn't changed as far as we're aware. Second,
Well, it's classified, but yeah.
as far as I know, that it hasn't changed. But maybe it comes out that it has changed. But as far as we know, we haven't seen any change whatsoever. But the second thing is, and this is the big thing, Russia would be more explicit in their nuclear threats. They would be a lot more deliberate. Like, if you have troops in Crimea, we will nuke you. If you listen to how Putin talks about nukes, it's like, we reserve the right to use nukes in situations where Russia's in a existential situation of survival. And you can interpret that combined with other speeches to mean that maybe possibly they would use them in Ukraine. But the thing is, nukes have most been effectively used historically as a negotiating tool, either to dissuade invasion, dissuade war, or to kind of bully other nation states. It is used as military leverage that we have the capacity of the fucking sun and we'll throw it into your nation if shit gets too spicy.
Or to
And
incinerate Japan.
basically, and so I think that when you view it from that angle, he would want to get as much as he could out of the threat without actually having to use it. Because if he does make the threat and then he doesn't use it, then Russia's nuclear umbrella looks weaker. Because it looks like they're not committed when they make explicit threats. But the thing is, they haven't made explicit threats. In fact, they flip-flopped on this issue multiple times. On November 17th, literally like 4 days ago, the Kremlin's press secretary, Peskov, was almost gaslighting everyone, saying no one in Russia has ever spoken of using nuclear weapons. I don't know what you're talking about. Like, when nuclear weapons in Ukraine, what do you mean? Then you talk to the Russian ambassador to Britain, and he'll say, no, we would never. There's no scenario we're going to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Then you get the one guy, and he's like, I don't know, maybe. Like, if we were really going towards a situation where they can use nuclear weapons, they use it first as a negotiating tool to try to get as much as they can by making explicit threats before they would ever use it. And that just hasn't happened. They keep flip-flopping on it. And
Hold on. I mean, first of all, my basic interpretation of what those random ambassadors say. I know what you're talking about. I saw the Sky News interview with the Russian ambassador in the UK. I basically just discount what they say as like actually being reflective of what the policy is in Russia, because all those people were denying that the invasion was going to happen, right?
True.
Including the including the UN ambassadors.
Wait, but there's a difference there.
And so forth.
There's a major difference there, Michael. And the difference is that I've already tried to establish, nukes are most useful when intimidating people and as a negotiating
Okay, but how about this?
tool.
How about this?
So the thing is, if they were trying to use it actually they would be making a threat before they would pull the trigger, because not making a threat and just randomly pulling the trigger you get nothing out of it except for a terror campaign and an economic collapse of your nation state, and
Okay.
possibly American strikes on Russian troops in Ukraine.
Okay, here's another component of it though that is worth bearing in mind, maybe almost on equal plane. The longer the war is protracted, the longer that it's possible that there could be some unforeseen event, incident, accident, miscommunication, what have you, that could actually precipitate nuclear exchange under conditions that we can't even fully envision at the moment. Look at what happened with the Poland missiles last week. Okay, that was pretty dicey. I'm actually curious what you made of that, because I'm sure you're aware that instantaneously you had not just Zelensky, but what is it, Reznikov, the defense minister, Yernak, the top advisor, others who were making statements of fact that Russia had deliberately attacked Poland with missile strikes, okay? And demanding, in their own way, that retaliatory action be taken at once against Russia to punish them for that attack on a NATO member state.
Wait, when you say
now, let me finish.
Well,
Let me finish.
Okay.
So, as far as we know, that particular incident is not going to be used as the justification for launching some sort of World War III scenario. But the longer the war goes on, it's going to remain a possibility that stuff in that vein, meaning unforeseen incidents, could occur that would then maybe trigger some sort of wider escalation. That's just sort of an inherent fact of war, because it's unpredictable, it's chaotic, it's not able to be uniformly contained. And so, yeah, you are accepting risk of an incident like that occurring as you protract the war ever further. So, I mean, is that unreasonable?
I guess for me, the first thing I would say when it comes to that missile strike, even if Russia did that, even if it was found out that Russia did it, I don't think it would have caused World War III. It probably would have caused an increase of anti-air support for Ukraine, which is what the Ukrainians seem to have been aiming for with that.
What they're getting anyway.
It's what they're getting anyway, which I agree with that, because they used reports seem to indicate that what the missile was an old Soviet S-300 missile made in the 1970s in the Soviet Union. And if you're using 50-year-old equipment, and it's an S-300, so it shouldn't have exploded upon impact on the ground. It should have been deactivated, indicating that there was something wrong with the missile, that either it was degraded by age or time. I think giving them more effective air defense not only saves Ukrainian lives, but it'll probably make it harder for there to be spillover in the future.
So you're saying,
wait, I gotta finish my thought. Either it's going to stop spillover more accurately when it comes to Russian missiles, because it's going to knock them out of the sky, and it's less likely that the more updated equipment will spill over. I'm just saying that I don't think this scenario had a particularly high risk. When it comes to that question you're asking about, like the length of time, there have been instances where American and Chinese planes have just crashed into each other. Like, I don't know if you remember this, but it was like an American spy plane crashed into a Chinese plane, killing all the Chinese pilots, and that didn't really cause a nuclear escalation of anything.
It wasn't pursuant to a hot war.
Yeah, it wasn't. Well, sorry, I didn't hear you.
That wasn't pursuant to a hot war, right? We're talking about a hot war here.
That isn't pursuant to a hot war, but we've had incidents either whether it was the support of the Mujahideen, or the support or the Soviet support of the Viet Cong, or the Chinese support of the Viet Cong, or there have been many instances where either the Soviet Union supporting an American enemy or the United States is supporting a Soviet enemy, where stuff like this has occurred and World War III hasn't broken out. And so for me,
so you roll the dice.
Yeah, I'm comfortable rolling the dice here, because I think rolling the dice at the other end of the table, let's say we say, okay, the nuclear threat's too much, we have to cave, we have to give them some of what they want. That behavior is going to encourage bad actors to just scramble for nuclear weapons, not only for their own defense, which seems to be the idea, like Kim Jong-un and others have scrambled for them, but the idea of, like, you can launch offensive wars, lose terribly, then threaten to blow up the world, and you'll at least get something out of it. That's going to encourage bad behavior. That's going to cause more nuclear escalatory incidents in the future, and that is something I want to avoid.
Well, you're right. I mean, over the course of the Cold War, there were many incidents of incredibly disturbing knife's edge nuclear brinksmanship between the United States in the Soviet Union. In fact, during the in 1969, Richard Nixon sent a secret aerial mission to the Arctic region, in proximity to Russia, with the express intent to actually foment nuclear brinksmanship as like a warning, like a shot across the bow, right? So that's been done deliberately by the U.S. and by Soviet Union in different contexts. But the general understanding or the general conclusion about those incidents of nuclear brinksmanship, where the fate of civilization could have genuinely been hanging in the balance, is that those ought to be avoided, right? You want fewer of those incidents rather than more. And the protraction of the war guarantees at least a substantially increased likelihood of incidents such as those. Because
I agree
this is
with
different
you.
than this. This is
But this
different.
encourages the behavior down the road.
This is quite different than Cold War era incidents of nuclear brinksmanship, because we're talking about a hot war. I mean, there was no hot war during the Cold War period with the Soviet Union, when the U.S. is at such direct kind of combat proximity with the Soviet Union. I'm aware of the funding of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, obviously, but this Ukraine war is of a radically different order.
I can tell you that there were Soviet soldiers in Vietnam killing American soldiers. That was something that occurred. Like that,
right?
They shot down American helicopters with like Soviet missiles.
Sure, but the United States policy posture and general philosophy toward Vietnam was not that if it loses, quote unquote, in Vietnam, that means the end of the American state and the American ideological project. It means that the United States is relenting on the curtailment of the spread of communism or something along those lines, right? Whereas the stakes here are much different. Russia at least publicly articulates that it views the stakes of the Ukraine war as defeat means basically the expurgation of Russia itself. And Biden, I mean, people walked back this comment, but I was in Poland at the time. He gave a statement in his address in Warsaw, I think it was March 24th, if I'm not mistaken, where at the climactic, the dramatic climax of the speech, Biden basically calls for regime change in Russia, calls for the ouster of Putin, which was unprecedented. So yeah, that also heightens the stakes. Lloyd Austin went to Ukraine for the first time since the war had started in April and said that the point of U.S. policy is, not just to secure "quote unquote" victory for Ukraine, but to actually
weaken Russia.
Weaken Russia. And although there was a bit of consternation seemingly about him expressing the policy goals in such stark terms, there's really no indication at all that the fundamental policy has changed. Maybe the rhetorical posture has changed somewhat, but it's the same policy as you just mentioned. Like, they haven't actually changed anything about the status quo. If anything, they continue to escalate it in terms of higher and higher caliber weaponry and more expenditure and so forth. So yeah, I mean, that creates sort of a tinderbox situation where would it shock you if there were some unforeseen incident, in a month or 2 months from now, akin to what happened with the Polish missiles?
It could happen, but I think it would probably end in a similar style. Like is always likely in these types of scenarios. But I want to. I guess I'm not sure. Wait. We've wandered away from my core point here.
I know, but I really just want to ask a quick question. You really think that Biden, if it were established, like if Biden went out there and claimed that Russia did what Ukraine claimed happened, which apparently didn't, but that Ukraine claimed it, right? That Russia deliberately launched missiles at Poland, a NATO member state, caused fatalities. You think Biden would just say, all's well, c'est la vie. All my proclamations about defending every inch of NATO territory, we're just going to bracket that for now and just like kind of pretend that nothing happened and maybe accept an apology. You think that would have been the response by the U.S. if what Ukraine said happened actually did happen?
Okay. I think that if the situation was, it was determined that Russia did it deliberately, which, by the way, almost immediately the United States says it didn't seem like a deliberate act. because there would be no reason for them to do that deliberately unless they were trying to test the waters, but it's impossible to prove that. But if it was found that Russia did deliberately strike Poland, then there would be a response. I'm saying that response is very unlikely to unfurl into nuclear war. It would most likely unfurl into more aid to Ukraine, or more air defense for Ukraine, or possibly, if there was a singular strike on Poland, a singular strike in response on Russian troops in Ukraine, something along those lines. But the odds of it escalating into a nuclear war, where I think a lot of people view, like, if one NATO soldier gets shot, the world explodes. It's they're like soldiers on one side of the aisle shaking, and the other one aisle is shaking, and if one just twitches wrong and pulls the trigger, the whole world explodes. And that popular portrayal of the Cold War and of this war, I think, is untrue. I think that is untrue. That is what I'm saying.
But you're saying,
you said you would ask me one question. You said you'd ask me one question.
Yeah,
okay,
you're right.
I want to bring us back to the core thing, and that is,
okay,
and this is the core thing I want you to address, is that if we establish the standard that Russia can make nuclear threats after failing an invasion. And let me compare this to, like, let's say if we just threatened to nuke all of Vietnam in the last year of the war, if, the Viet Cong didn't submit. The Soviet Union would have laughed in our face. The whole world would have laughed in our face. In fact, MacArthur, for suggesting a thing in Korea, actually lost his job. And the North Koreans and the Chinese never at any point said, man, maybe we should actually halt the war immediately to stop these threats. And those were scenarios, I would say, Korea especially, where nuclear war was much more likely, because we're talking 1950s nuclear technology. We're talking, like, MacArthur is like a high-ranking official actually proposing nuclear strikes. But the rest of the world didn't establish the standard of, oh, that idea is entertained, therefore we're going to give you everything you want. And the reason why they didn't is if they established that standard, what that tells to nations like North Korea, to nations like Israel, to any nation with nukes, or any 2-bit dictator that would want to get nukes, it tells them the idea that, hey, not only can you use these nukes to dissuade of an invasion of your country, you can invade a country, fail miserably, and then just say, I'll blow everybody up if you don't give me the country. And then you have to secede to them because they made the big threat. Even though we know most likely they're not going to pull the trigger on it, because the person who's going to be most fucked by the use of the nuclear weapon is going to be the person who probably launched it, the nation state that personally launched it. So I that's what I don't want to encourage. I don't want to encourage this type of behavior in other scenarios, because I could 100% see Pakistan getting some ideas about Kashmir and making nuclear threats around that, or Israel making nuclear threats under certain scenarios similar to that, or if Iran gets nuclear weapons, them doing something similar to that, or say Eritrea gets it, or fucking Idi Amin, some fucking crazy dictator like that.
Eritrea. That's a new one.
Yeah, who knows? And what I'm trying to say is we don't want to encourage these weapons
Canada
to become a tool of offensive warfare, not defensive warfare, which up to this point was what was in the Russian constitution. It's the idea that we'll use this to defend the territorial integrity of Russia. And up to now, and it seems as this war is playing out, as they're losing this so-called annexed territory, they're not using a nuclear weapon, it doesn't seem like they're going to use it. They're flip-flopping on it. And again, we just can't encourage this behavior.
Well, I don't know if they're flip-flopping or not. It seems like, a spin on what the U.S. calls in certain contexts strategic ambiguity, like, with regard to Taiwan. Maybe that, kind of captures what the Russia's public statements on this question amount to, sort of like vaguely contradictory remarks here and there, by different officials. Hard to really pin down like what the current policy thinking really is at any given moment. And, that maybe that's by design and that you want to keep it ambiguous. I guess I'm just dubious that somehow the scenario you're sketching out would genuinely enshrine some sort of unprecedented blockbuster new standard whereby every country around the world that might have nuclear weapons or might seek to acquire them is now going to be emboldened by the lessons of Russia and Ukraine, because it shows that you can do whatever you want in terms of offensive warfare if you have the looming nuclear threat that you can invoke. I think that's a flattering way of putting it in terms of kind of providing a built-in justification for the status quo of U.S. policy. But I think
But why not?
All kinds of different
why
contexts.
wouldn't that happen?
Hold on. I think in all kinds of different contexts, what you see to be the pattern is that interventionists will say, look, if we let this thing happen, it's going to create a new precedent. It's going to embolden bad actors the world over. Whereas when you really drill down, there's really very little compelling evidence, virtually ever, that you have that conflict A on one side of the world actually has this kind of causal effect on conflict B somewhere else because of some new international standard that's supposedly been enshrined. I mean, that was like even used for what to argue as to why Obama needed to adhere to his declarations around the supposed red lines in Syria, because if he didn't make Assad pay, meaning launch a regime change war against Assad, if he didn't make Assad pay for supposedly crossing the red line around chemical weapons use, then that was going to embolden dictators all over the world, and it was going to be
They were right.
Violent chaos
right
everywhere
that,
you look. And it's always kind of just a trumped up, exaggerated,
but that's what happened.
Interested. Sorry?
That's what. Wait. So Barack Obama said that if you cross this line, then we're going to do something about it. Basically, we're gonna either bomb you, remove you, something along those lines. He then proceeds to cross.
Well, he never specified. Yeah.
He doesn't specify, but he proceeds to cross that line, and the United States does relatively little. I mean, there was Operation Inherent Resolve, but that mostly targeted ISIS. And what did that tell Bashar al-Assad? That basically he could do whatever he wanted to a civilian population.
Well, there was a pretty expansive CIA regime change operation that went on for quite a while, but yeah.
Before that threat was made, that threat indicates the threat indicates that he's going to change something. That if you do this, there's going to be a response. But there wasn't really a response. And when you don't give a response after making a threat, not only does that make the United States look less credible, but it also tells that person in question that they're bullshitting you. You can do whatever the fuck you want. They're not going to do anything. Either Obama shouldn't have made the statement at all, or if he's going to make the statement, he has to follow through on it, or it degrades not only America's word, but basically tells him that he can brutalize your civilian population as much as you want. And he ended up doing that. The most civilians that died in the Syrian civil war was at the hands of the Syrian government and Russian bombing.
Yeah, but that wasn't my point. That wasn't my point.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is it did set a precedent.
But that wasn't the precedent that I was referring to. The precedent that hawks at the time, like John McCain and whomever. And by the way, it's the McCain style foreign policy worldview used to be considered kind of crankish and dangerous, but now it's been fully absorbed into just the mainstream liberal consensus, which is worth reminding people of every now and then. But anyway, like what McCain and people of his ilk would have said in 2013 is the precedent that Obama was enshrining was not just to do with Syria itself in terms of not applying repercussions when the red line was crossed. It was that it was emboldening bad actors all around the world, right? So they're positing some kind of causal link between the failure of Obama to hold his end of the bargain in terms of the red line warning in Syria with North, they would tie it to like North Korea. They would tie it to even to Putin or whoever else, Libya.
I mean,
and really, there's never, and when you drill down empirically, there is almost never any good reason to suppose that these causal links between disparate conflicts actually exist in the way that interventionists claim they do, especially because they tend to appeal to this notion that you just appealed to of so-called credibility, which is kind of like, I mean, the best way I think about that credibility concept, it's like this fictitious currency that hawks and foreign policy operators who are interventionists invent because that to kind of almost trade on the world stage in terms of this currency that doesn't exist, can't be proven or falsified. Credibility, what does that even mean? I mean, it's not like a real thing. It's not a tangible thing that can be evaluated, right? It's just whatever you make of it at the time. And so I guess the general point is that I am dubious overall about the transferability of lessons or standards or precedents that supposedly are going to get enshrined in Ukraine in terms of other conflicts. Like, I think it's kind of almost a bit arrogant. I'm not saying you're arrogant, right? I'm not like criticizing you, but it seems like it's almost like there's certain intellectual arrogance involved in suggest. Well, I mean, I think there's a certain level of intellectual arrogance embedded in the supposition that somehow Pakistan and some theoretical incursion to Kashmir is going to be directly and proximately influenced by some unknown standard that gets actualized
This
in
isn't an
Ukraine. Like,
unknown
really, you know
standard.
that? How do you know that? I mean,
I know this because it already has like this isn't like some made up thing I'm making up. The nuclear taboo is a real thing. If you look it up, it has a Wikipedia page. The idea that you do not use nuclear weapons in warfare has been established ever since the end of the Second World War, because these weapons got so destructive and so many people got them that if you push one domino over, there's a possibility that not only are you going to kill tons of civilians in that use, and it's going to be disastrous for the climate, and like Ukrainians know that better than anyone. I mean, they're one of the few states that understand that with the experience of Chernobyl. But it also, there's a chance of like all these nation states having to eventually pull the trigger and there being a world-ending event. This is a real thing. This isn't like a made-up thing I just made up. And so if you're talking about a scenario where nation states are invading countries, Russia being the example here, and then they just lose flat out. Russia has not achieved any of its original goals whatsoever. They lose, but then they just start making nuclear threats, and that forces their opposition to do nothing but submit to them. What is that like, but like basically a guidebook to any nation state in the world that wants to claim and conquer territory, that you basically can get at least part of what you want as long as you have the kill millions button on your table.
Okay. Here's another prong of my answer to address that. In terms of why I am dubious that there really would be this world-altering, new, unprecedented standard enshrined if the scenario with Ukraine and Russia transpires in the way that you suggest. And I hope people don't think that I'm doing cheap whataboutism here. I'm genuinely just trying to establish or to illustrate the point. I'm not like drawing a moral equivalency or any of that. However, the United States has invaded, as I'm sure you're aware, many countries over the course of history, including recent history. We don't have to list them all, but people even forget about some of them, Grenada, Panama, stuff like that, okay? And simultaneously to those invasions, the United States has been resolute in maintaining, as a matter of doctrine, everybody likes to talk about Russian nuclear doctrine, oddly less attention paid to American nuclear doctrine as it's expressed publicly anyway. And there was, by the way, just two or 3 weeks ago, a nuclear posture review finally released under the Biden administration for the first time, which expressly reserves the right to use nuclear weapons for basically any reason, not just as a defensive response to something, but to achieve military objectives so far as the commander-in-chief should see fit to do. That's the posture, okay? And so when you were saying that, Russia's engaging in nuclear blackmail, well, I mean, the United States' entire hegemonic military position is predicated on the implicit threat of nuclear blackmail. Now, the United States is powerful enough that it doesn't have to go around like North Korea or something, kind of making these outlandishly overt threats of nuclear annihilation, because it's all kind of understood. It doesn't need to be stated in such, jarring and explicit terms. But, the United States basically wields the leverage of its nuclear arsenal in order to advance its geopolitical interests around the world, including many examples of offensive warfare, whether it's full-fledged invasions like Iraq, or even more, kinetic warfare in a global war on terror context. Whatever. The point is, it gives the United States, through quote-unquote blackmail, the security umbrella such that many countries know that they could be incinerated in the blink of an eye if they actually do take some kind of aggressive military action against the United States. So what I'm getting at is nuclear blackmail, so to say, which is sort of now taken on this new Russia-specific connotation in reference to Ukraine. That's always been an operative factor, or at least since in the modern era, it's been an operative factor in the United States' own nuclear posture. Same with the Soviet Union. Here an interesting example that I've never really heard addressed sufficiently is that after 9/11, George W. Bush, promulgates this new doctrine saying we will make no distinction. I mean, the United States will make no distinction between the terrorist groups like Al Qaeda and the countries that harbor them, right? So if you're Afghanistan and that you're the Taliban, doesn't matter if you're not operationally coordinating with Al Qaeda. We're holding you responsible for the fact that Al Qaeda is being harbored within your country, right? Okay, Pakistan, it was later demonstrated, harbored bin Laden himself for a decade or so. And there had been other Al Qaeda senior level officials who had transited in and out of Pakistan. Now, if that was actually the logic that the Bush administration genuinely was committed to, I remember it was bipartisan at the time. I mean, Democrats complained here and there, but they were basically on board. There was never any notion of invading Pakistan and changing the regime. Why? Well, probably in large part because Pakistan has nuclear blackmail at its disposal, right? I mean, that's not the only reason I'm simplifying. But the point is, nuclear blackmail is not just now suddenly this horrifying, heretofore unprecedented standard that now everybody's going to be burdened with having to contend with.
I think
because of whatever happens in Ukraine. It's always been in the ether. Yeah, I mean, the Ukraine situation has its own unique qualities, but I kind of reject the novelty of the way that you're kind of framing the potential emergence of this new standard.
This is not comparable to any of those scenarios, though. A comparable scenario would be not the implicit backroom, we have the ability to use a nuke thing, but a comparable example would be us invading Vietnam. We start to lose, and we say, "Fine, we will use a nuke unless the Viet Cong stop attacking the South Vietnamese government. We will irradiate the landscape. We will irradiate. We're going to use the nuke. We're going to break the nuclear taboo for this." That would be a comparable example. Or if MacArthur tried to do it in Korea. Thankfully, Truman was not a big supporter of that, and he ended up firing the guy for it. Or if we did that in Afghanistan, could you imagine if Trump got in office and he was like, "Look, if the Taliban don't surrender, I'm just going to nuke all the mountains. And then they can't even fight them because they're all going to have third legs and shit." He says that in some type of Trumpism. That would be something that would be comparable to me. But because these are invasions where we're failing, and because we can't accept the fact that we're taking an L in leaving, like the Soviets had to do in Afghanistan, we had to do in Afghanistan, we had to do in Vietnam, right? We had to do in all these locations, we had to do with the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. Instead of accepting that L and moving on, the Russians are saying, "No, we'll take an L and then we'll nuke this country we're invading anyway." That is a break in precedent. We will, and if you don't give us everything that we didn't win in combat, then we're just going to irradiate the landscape. That is different from what the United States has done since the end of the Second World War. That's different from what the Chinese have done since the end of the Second World War. This is very different. And if they were to actually pull the trigger on it, it would be a massive break in precedent. And if we don't respond to this by not rewarding it, then that will be sending a message.
Well, sure. I mean, no comparative assessment between different conflicts over different eras are ever going to be perfect in their comparative value, right? I mean, there's never going to be a perfectly apt comparison to make. I mean, even the Vietnam comparison you're invoking, I mean, there are huge differences that you could cite that make potentially that comparison inapt. I mean, and one of them being that, the Soviet Union was like this global ideological project in a way that Russia currently isn't. I'm not saying that necessarily undercuts the validity of the comparison. I'm just saying that you can cite reasons why you might doubt the validity of these cross-temporal comparisons, right? And even on Vietnam, I don't know if you saw this, but it was only just fairly recently, I think 2017, that it came out finally, after decades, that General Westmoreland, William Westmoreland, the top general in Vietnam, drew up plans for the use of these so-called tactical nuclear weapons in Vietnam.
But why didn't we do it?
It got to the operational stage.
Do you know why we didn't do it though?
Sorry?
We didn't do it because A, it wouldn't have worked, and B, the repercussions would be immense. The same is true about if the Russians were to do it now.
No, I know. Of course we didn't. Of course it wasn't actually done. All I'm saying is that the specter of it was a very potent tool in the arsenal of the United States to attempt to achieve its objectives. That, it didn't happen in Vietnam ultimately, But I'm
It
saying
hasn't happened
the
in any war
idea that it's
ever.
unprecedented for nuclear blackmail to be in the kind of again a very lethal tool in the arsenal in terms of coercive power of the United States to pursue its interests. That's been the case for decades. It's just not done in this more brash antagonistic way that is now being done by Russia in the context of a hot war, which has its own unique qualities and is,
But
you know,
the difference
actually is
here,
unprecedented in
the
certain ways.
difference
I'm not
here
contesting that.
The difference
Um,
here is they're invading another country. They fail in their capacities to beat said country. So then they basically rely on almost like nuclear terror threats to try to get what they want instead. It hasn't succeeded. They seem to be flip flopping on it. But if we were to reward this type of behavior or to say this is good, wouldn't this say to other state actors that this is the way to go? It works. This is different than a operational thing being proposed in a room but never making it to the public until 2017. It would have been different in the United States as making the threat. It would be like Bay of Pigs invasion fails, we're gonna nuke Cuba. Like that would be the example, since that's right at America's doorstep. That's something that I would say is more close to American like national security than Vietnam was.
yeah. Well, I mean, Kennedy later estimated that the risk of nuclear war breaking out in the Cuban Missile Crisis was as high as 1 in 3, so like a 33% chance. I think he even might have gone up to 1 in 2 at a certain point. So, um, if the United States conducts itself over the course of a human missile crisis, which and demonstrate that it is potentially willing to utilize its nuclear arsenal, then that has this kind of like blackmail type effect where it's sending the signal that you're talking about and disincentivizes any kind of aggressive action against the United States because it's
Do
showing
you
that it actually is potentially willing to go to that extreme.
Do you
I guess, I
think
guess
the
I,
do you
yeah.
think the Taliban or the Viet Cong ever seriously considered the idea that they were going to be nuked by the United States if they continued to fight back?
No, and that wasn't a live issue because the Taliban didn't have a nuclear arsenal, but we're in a different situation because Russia has the world's largest nuclear arsenal, or that's the common understanding anyway. So yeah, I mean that's no, of course, I don't think that was ever really contemplated by the Taliban.
Well, but to them, like, why would they not consider that? Like, they're beating the United States. Why wouldn't the United States use the nuclear weapon? It's because there's a million disincentives stopping them from doing so, and that would be setting a new international precedent that you could just lose wars, and the only solution is okay. I'm just gonna just blow up and destroy the whole country until eventually they submit with nuclear weapons. That is
Well, because
different.
the United States didn't loot quota. I mean, the United States failure in Afghanistan was not that by conventional military means it failed in its strategic objectives, right? The failure came decades, literally, after 9/11, after the government had, I mean, the United States succeeded in toppling the government of Afghanistan, right, and installing a client state. Um, the failure came later in the more like nation building slash kind of just permanent occupation phase where the United States didn't have the will or desire to apply massive overwhelming military force anymore to like totally expurgate the remaining factions of insurgent forces, right? So which would be different if Russia is basically throwing all it has at Ukraine in terms of conventional military ability, calling up, hundreds of thousands of troops, throwing the kitchen sink, and then still is unable to succeed in a conflict that the leadership says has these existential stakes. And so, that may get to a point. Again, I'm not saying this is possible. I don't know. Nobody knows. Uh, but it's worth at least maybe being mindful of. Could lead to a
Okay.
point where they actually do think that this is our last option, and who knows? I mean, I don't think to me, launching an invasion at all is not in comportment with my idea of rationality. Whether it's quote defensive or offensive, even just presiding over the apparatus of a military uh, command seems to me to be come with it all kinds of irrational presumptions and acceptance of different premises. So like I'm just assuming that my trains of thought in terms of how I conceive of rational inquiry of these issues is not going to be shared by key decision makers in the United States, in Ukraine, and in Russia,
Mhm.
right? So, in light of that, and in light of like the inherent massive uncertainty that that entails, the thing that you can be empirically certain of, I would suggest, is that the protraction of the war does make ever more possible the emergence of certain incidents or unforeseen events that could precipitate a wider escalation. I mean, even before you were saying, look, I think people are kind of getting ahead of themselves when they say that some retaliation by the United States, if there was a missile strike in Poland, would automatically lead to World War III. You're probably right. That's not a given. But then you said,
Actually, quite low. The chances of that happening in that are actually quite low.
but then you said one of the feasible scenarios, right, is that the United States does a kinetic strike on Russia. I mean, that would have been unthinkable a year ago, or pretty much unthinkable, that there'd be direct kinetic warfare between the United States and Russia. That never even got close to happening
That's
in the
not.
Cold War with the Soviet Union. Okay, so that would also
That's
already be a
not.
Rubicon
I mean, kind
being
of.
crossed,
I mean,
and then who knows what
we
follows
did
from
that
that.
in Syria, though. We had the Battle of Kasham. We killed like what was it, like 20 to 30 Russian soldiers in Syria at the Battle of Kasham. Wagner boys.
Okay, those were private. Those were the technically private, Wagner Group
Yeah,
forces,
but
right?
it is in
And that
essence
was
the
that
same
was
thing,
that was
though.
heavily fraught too. But Syria was never viewed as so decisively within the Russian national interest as Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine, at least the way that they talk about it, it's like absolutely
So
central
it
to
is. It is.
their how they envision the fate of Russian civilization in a way that Syria never was.
I already have expressed my disagreement with this about I do think it encourages behavior, but I want to move on because it's already past midnight and
Yeah,
I
yeah,
want to
yeah.
and I want to get on to I'll shorten it down to two last questions because I had four,
Okay.
but I'll bring it down to the two. The first question I was going to ask was about how it's still overall the small percentage of our military budget that we sent over, but get rid of that question. And the other
Right.
one is about
You can ask like I mean we can do rapid
Yeah,
fire if you want because I
yeah,
feel
but
bad if we didn't
it's
address them.
okay. It's okay. We can just do another call at another time. And the other one was
Okay.
about Ukraine being the front line for the democracy. Anyway, here's the first question.
Damn, those are
Is
juicy questions. I'm chomping at the bit.
And this one is I think going to become an ideological difference. Is
Okay.
war the worst thing? Is my question to you.
Is war the worst thing?
Is there things worse than war? This is a very
Man.
serious question. I mean it.
Well, this is like an open-ended, almost like philosophical.
Yeah, because
Question.
the way you just talk about, like, for example, how the Chinese just want to end the war as quickly as possible. What I'm trying to say is I don't think war is the worst thing. And when I say worst thing, I don't mean it's not bad. It's bad, but there are some things that are worse than fighting a war. Subjugation, slavery, genocide, like things that I think are perfectly like appropriate to fight a war to stop or fight a war to defeat. If there's a genocide going on, I think it's perfectly reasonable for, say, Bosnians or Muslims during the Yugoslav civil wars to fight back against said genocide. If there is an invasion war where they're trying to annex you and take away your democracy and stuff like that, that I think that is worse than war. Ultimately, it's up to each individual to determine whether they'd be willing to go to war and defend their country in these scenarios. But the Ukrainians have made a determination that subjugation to the Russian state is worse than war. And so when we have these discussions about prolonging the war, and I see a lot of people talk about this as a very they care a lot about Ukraine, and the reason they want the war to end is they just want people to die. And everybody wants the war to end, but if ending the war right now, the price for that is Ukrainian freedom or Ukrainian subjugation, Ukrainians don't seem to agree to that. So I do think there are things that are worse than war.
Yeah, I guess in an abstract philosophical sense, you can imagine certain kinds of harms that would be, in a way worse than war. So, for example, seems going to sound ridiculous, but we're in sort of like ridiculous abstract philosophical territory here. It would be worse than war if all of a sudden an asteroid collides with Earth and wipes out all of human
It's
civilization, right?
is this really
That's
that
worse than war.
abstract? It feels like I am saying that Ukrainians continuing to fight the war is less bad than them giving up and giving themselves to subjugation. They have made that determination for themselves. I have also given examples where fighting a war I think is morally justifiable during genocides. For example, I think the United States was also very morally correct to fight the Civil War and win it. I think there are examples where war is bad, but it is not the worst option. And I think this is one of those examples.
Okay. Well, I would maybe question the separability of genocide and war when, when if a genocide is carried out, typically it would be within the context of a war. So like that, so like in other words, genocide would be encompassed under the umbrella of what a war is, at least as I generally tend to see it, and that seems to be borne out throughout history when you look at examples of genocide. I'm not sure if you're explicitly describing the situation in Ukraine as a genocide. I think that's kind of an open issue in terms of the semantic applicability.
Have you read the New Lines report on this question?
The what report?
There's the New Lines Institute published a report about this is a kind of older report now. It was earlier in the war, but I still think it's really good for people to read. They published a report about the possibility of genocide occurring in Ukraine, and they list out like the characteristics of a genocide and what it looks like when you lead up to a genocide. And the conclusion they came to is that they don't know if a genocide is occurring right now, but they can't, it's just almost impossible to confirm something like that. But they said that the possibility for genocide is definitely possible in Ukraine. You look at the dehumanization, the denial of Ukrainian identity, like this idea that Ukraine is a disease of the mind, as Dmitry Medvedev said, who was the former president of Russia, one of Putin's allies. It was a really interesting report. I'd highly recommend you read it.
Okay. I guess, just when you're asking me, is there anything worse than war? And you're saying that, to your mind, genocide could be among the things that are worse than war, or you think that war could be justified in order to curtail a genocide. I kind of view genocide as collapsed within the category of war, right? So I'm not really certain on the defensibility of trying to separate out those two phenomena. They seem almost always one and the same to me.
Would you say that the genocide against the Jews started like before or after the entry into World War II? Or better scenario, do you think a genocide could exist outside of a war? Like, for example, Myanmar genocided the Rohingya Muslims. I think that was an example of a genocide that occurred outside of like what you would consider an official war.
Well, what is an official war, right? I'm not an expert on the Myanmar genocide. Maybe you might have more information on it than me, but my understanding is, or let's just, I do know more about the Nazi Holocaust, so let's just focus on that because I don't want to speak out of school on Myanmar. Yeah, without going down that rabbit hole necessarily, which I have gotten drawn into at times, and it actually is pretty interesting debate.
Do you regret your tweets about the Holocaust or any of those?
Sorry?
Do you regret any of the tweets you made about the Holocaust?
No, not at all. Have you read any of my essays on the subject? I know some people just only look at tweets, but
no, I don't not read. I haven't. Read
I regret. I famously or infamously did delete some tweets on the Holocaust because I recognize that, it's a subject that uniquely lends itself to decontextualized extrapolations about your supposed intent, and you could be called a denier or something, and which is ironic because if you actually I don't know if you've ever read an article I've written. I'm not saying you have to or anybody does, but in the actual like fully developed version of the argument. Sorry?
Do people still read?
Very good question. Well, they read tweets, but that's like,
That's true.
Little dopamine hits worth of reading. People actually do read my Substack, or at least some do. At least they tell me so. I deleted I regret not being maybe a bit more conscientious about sort of modulating my willingness to engage in like an iterative Twitter-sized debate about the Holocaust, which like is not maybe the most wise discursive approach. But this idea that I don't regret it on the substance or on the merits at all, because this idea, people send out this one particular screenshot that I was kind of It was a reply that I was goaded into making. Not that that exculpates me. I'm responsible for what I tweet. But this idea that that one particular screenshot, I mean, I can't even tell you exactly what the quote is, but that it means like I'm a Holocaust denier, or like,
So to
oh,
be
I have some
clear,
weird attitudes toward the
I just want to
Jews.
know.
I
So,
mean, it's like
so you're saying
it's
you
totally.
stand? I'm just want to know. So you're saying you stand by the merits of what you tweeted, but
I
you
stand
did
by the
delete it,
merits of everything I've tweeted on the subject. Yes.
including the things you deleted.
Yeah, because I'm telling you, I deleted I deleted those particular. I deleted a handful of tweets one morning. Okay, because I thought it was not prudent or wise to get into a extended, protracted Twitter-sized debate on a very complex, fraught topic as the Holocaust. Okay,
Okay.
so I didn't delete them because I rescind the substance. I deleted them, for practical reasons. Maybe it wasn't even worth it to delete them because people got the screenshot anyway. I don't know. All I'm telling you is on the substance, and I don't. We can have another 4 hours on this,
Hey,
but
hey,
probably
don't
not.
worry, Michael. Elon
Yeah.
owns Twitter now. You can make as many tweets about the Holocaust as you want.
Well, I mean, it wasn't that my tweets violated the terms of service, right? It was that
Yeah.
they were being deliberately misconstrued to suggest I'm a Holocaust denier, which is ironic because if you actually read, I mean, any good faith reading of what I've said on the topic, at least as it pertains to U.S. intervention in World War II, would know beyond a shadow of a doubt, because it's written in like the most plain English that I could possibly muster, that my entire argument is predicated on the existence, not just the existence of the Holocaust, right? Predicated on the Holocaust being one of the most grave historical ills ever inflicted on humanity, right? So that was the whole point, right? The whole point was to evaluate whether U.S. military
I
intervention, as
believe.
is
I don't
popularly
think.
assumed, had a mitigating effect. Okay, but that's not the point.
I believe the accusation wasn't that you're. I think the majority of the accusation wasn't that you're a Holocaust denier, that you denied it
Oh
happened.
well, I
It
mean, I
seemed.
can.
Wait. Well, let me finish.
That accusation is made
I'm
often,
positive the accusation
including
is
by
made,
people in the
but I
media.
don't.
Okay.
What I'm saying it's not the majority of it. The majority of it seemed to be calling you a Holocaust revisionist, which there is a distinction where one is like people are saying you're changing facts about the Holocaust, like saying things that didn't happen or wasn't true, while other people are saying you're just denying it outright. I do think these two things are distinct, right?
Well, I mean, one of the problems with that is people, I think, misapprehend what revisionism means. I mean, revisionism, in terms of the people who are making that accusation against me, they seem to understand it as, oh, it's kind of like lower grade denialism, right? Or it's like a few degrees below outright denial. That's what revisionism is. It's like watered down denial. That's not what revisionism even means. I mean, if you look at just popular reviews of history books now, like mainstream history books or papers written by mainstream academics, published in mainstream publishing houses, etc. If a book is considered revisionist, that could be a praise for the book in that it's revising our maybe flawed or incomplete understanding of historical issues and therefore revising things. It's not revising facts or like fabricating things. No, it's just revising common understanding of certain historical issues. So, I mean, if that's the matter, if that makes me, if I'm a revisionist in that sense, okay, I accept that. But I think most people use it as to mean watered down denial, which of course
can I ask
is
you
not
one
at
more
all
question on this, but just a yes or no answer, and then we're gonna move on to the last question, okay?
All right, I don't know if I'm gonna get. I don't know if I'm gonna give a yes or no, but
okay,
I'll
but this is a very simple question, okay?
Okay.
Do you believe that American entry into the war in World War II is what caused the Holocaust? Yes or no?
No, I mean that's not my argument at all.
Okay, just making sure. Somebody wanted me.
I think there's. I mean, can I make a request since we've gone 3.5 hours? Will you please just read at your convenience, like the actual essay length articles I've written on the topic?
As long as you read the New Lines report, and I'll
read that.
Fantastic. Last question. So you've said that, and you said this at the start of the conversation, made a note of it. You said that you don't take a stance on whether the United States should or shouldn't send military aid or humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Right. To me, knowing that you've gone to Poland and knowing that you've talked to, it seems like you've talked to State Department officials and maybe
I went to the NATO summit.
You went to the NATO summit. You this war has been going on for like kind of 9 months. I think people have had enough time to like do some historical research behind the bounds of this war. And you've talked about it a lot. You tweet about it a lot. I mean, you've written Substack articles about it, even haven't read them all. I think I read one. I forget which one it was, but um, it seems like you know a decent amount about the war, at least to come to conclusions, because you've come to a lot of conclusions here and even brought up a thing or two today I didn't know. But the thing is,
Really? Like what?
how fuck,
Just
I
curious.
forget what it was. I remember making a
Okay.
note of it. I'll watch it back and I'll tell you. But the thing is, it feels like you should be able to have a stance on whether the United States should or shouldn't send aid to Ukraine. It feels slippery because I'm almost positive your answer is we shouldn't send military aid to Ukraine. And I feel like you would want to say it, but you're not saying it because then I could like somebody could hold you down and be like, here's the consequences of not sending military aid to Ukraine. What do you think about that? That I'm saying that I think you're being a little slippery when you don't answer that.
I find that curious because what reason would I have to be slippery on this topic? Like
I
what?
could I could
I
I
mean,
could
let me just answer.
Okay.
Right? I mean, we've
So it was a
gone three and a
hypothetical
half.
question, right? It was a hypothetical
No,
question.
I got it. I
Okay,
mean,
gotcha.
all I can do is try to honestly convey to you what truthfully is in my head and is truthfully reflects my views. Okay? And so it's not a matter of me not wanting to take a stance. I have a variety of pretty uh, conviction filled stances on this subject. It's just that they're not. It doesn't. It's not like a matter of a normative yes or no kind of referendum style judgment on the propriety of sending aid to Ukraine. I just don't feel that that's where my convictions lie. Right. So my convictions do lie in the necessity of taking a foundationally skeptical posture toward the policy, toward highlighting the risks associated with the policy or the ramifications of the policy that maybe have been, if not concealed,
Why just that? Why
underplayed,
not the
right?
benefits? Why don't you ever talk about the people liberated or the people saved? Like I looked at your Twitter a decent amount by now. I just followed you. Follow me back. And so I would imagine that like the vast majority of your tweets from what I've seen have been very like critical of Ukraine or critical of aid or at least examining it very deeply. I don't see a lot of
Sure.
examination of like the good that this aid has done.
Well, first of all, I would challenge I'm quote critical of Ukraine. Prior to, I mean, in a vacuum, I have no criticisms of Ukraine as such or Ukrainian people, which is why I actually do get. Um, I am genuinely troubled by people. Maybe it's in good faith, maybe it's not. I mean, all you can do is just listen to what they're saying. If there are people who interpret me as having some sort of deep-seated animus toward Ukraine itself or toward Ukrainian people, that's ridiculous. I think that those thoughts would never enter my mind. I mean, when I went to Poland, again, I'm not trying to be mushy or anything or self-aggrandizing, but I made a point, even though it like wouldn't really, under ordinary circumstances, be the focus of my journalistic output. Nonetheless, because I was there, I made a point to make sure without anybody scheduling anything for me or without any nonprofit setting up interviews or anything, I made sure to go out of my way and different parts of Poland, including a processing center for displaced Ukrainians, mostly women and children at the time, and others, throughout Poland. I made a point to speak to displaced people from Ukraine. Okay, and on a human level, of course, I got along perfectly well with them. Of course, I'm interviewing them. We even have a rapport. I empathize for their situation. I mean, I was told pretty harrowing stories about women having to kind of flee with their babies and stuff in the early portion of the war. So this idea that I have any kind of intrinsic antipathy for Ukraine is just nonsensical. And I say that because my frame of reference ultimately in analyzing the conflict is, for better or worse, maybe people can say that I ought to have a different frame of reference, or maybe they have a different one themselves. Mine happens to be through the prism of U.S. policy, okay? So I'm not critical of Ukraine for its own sake. Any criticism, so to say, that I make of Ukraine ultimately flows from that frame of reference that I'm starting with, right? So if I'm saying, oh, look, Zelensky and the Minister of Defense and Yernak, they, uh, on a knee-jerk kind of reflexive basis, sent out tweets immediately after the Polish missile incident, claiming that Russia deliberately launched the strikes, and that might be reflective of maybe a certain strain of irrationality or recklessness of this particular U.S. client. I'm only interested really in the subject because they are a client of the United States, because they're being singularly, I mean, you can quibble with the word singular, because they're being overwhelmingly, funded, armed, et cetera, by the United States. That's sort of the fulcrum of U.S. policy now, U.S. foreign policy right now, that it's engaged in these efforts with Ukraine. So that's why I'm making those so-called criticisms, right? It's not just criticism of Ukraine for its own sake. But ultimately, in terms of like, why don't am I being slippery by not saying I hereby oppose or hereby support U.S. aid to Ukraine? In all earnestness, and again, it seems bizarre that I would be consciously slippery about this, given that I feel like I'm pretty transparent, pretty open to engagement, even with people who disagree, as exemplified by this 3.5 hour discussion. It's not a matter of I only have access to my own conscious thoughts. My own conscious
you have
thought
your own
is
beliefs, right? You have your own like political beliefs.
But yeah,
I just don't
I have my
understand
own,
why you have no belief about this particularly,
I do have
especially since
beliefs.
you've done so much research.
I do have beliefs. I have beliefs. I've articulated a range of beliefs to you regarding the Ukraine war and U.S. policy in Ukraine. However, it's true that in terms of my own conscious thoughts, those beliefs don't extend to some sort of black or white moral judgment about whether it's good or bad to send aid to Ukraine, right? That's just not one of the beliefs that I've formulated. I have formulated other beliefs, right, about the lack of transparency in how the policy is being presented, about deliberate concealment, I would even argue, of the scope of the policy in certain respects, of the under recognized or kind of obfuscated risks associated with the policy. So I have very staunch beliefs and staunch convictions about a whole range of issues associated with the Ukraine war. But no, it doesn't, for me, boil down to this normative moral assessment. That's just not like my frame of reference for
Michael,
the issue. And I don't know what to say. I mean, it's not that.
You,
I mean, maybe if I was in Congress, right? If I was elected to Congress and I had to vote up or down on Ukraine appropriations, then I would be obliged to distill the essence of my beliefs into that yes or no kind of bifurcated
Michael, this
referendum.
this is great news for you. I've just been told that Joe Biden has disappeared. So has Kamala Harris and Nancy Pelosi. And by a very short writing campaign, you are now president of the United States. And I've been elected your secretary. I've been asked to deliver
I'm honored.
Your opinion.
My fellow Americans.
So I have this aid package right here. You're supposed to give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. It's headed for Ukraine. What are you going to give it, Mr. President?
Okay. And again, it's sort of frustrating for me because I know my answer to your question now is going to be taken as evidence that I'm just totally slippery and I'm not willing to answer forthrightly. But I just can't accept the premises underlying the scenario where I'm the president, right? I mean, because
one second. I'm writing this down for the Ukrainians. Won't accept the premises that I'm
that's right.
President. I'll send that to Zelensky. I'll send him a big question mark.
Because here's the thing. Because I try to look at this stuff from like first principles and with like the kind of very deeply ingrained skeptical instinct. Me being president and presiding over the military and national security apparatus of the United States, it would almost bound me to accept like an impossibly wide range of premises about the legitimacy of American military power that I just don't accept, like, or at least I'm not willing to just reflexively accept. Like the whole apparatus, the whole edifice is something that I question.
That's why it's a fun question. I'm asking you if you were forced to be in this position, like what you would do. It is ridiculous. It's ridiculous that somebody would ask that of me if I was president, but I would be like, yes, we should send the aid. I mean, it would be ridiculous for a 21-year-old to become president, but it's a fun scenario,
Well, maybe we'll amend the Constitution and you can run.
Okay, got you. I'll let the Ukrainians know it's in development. Well, you know what? you'll just appoint John Bolton to oversee the policy. I think that'll be the middle ground. Thank you so much for
Let me just ask you a very quick
yeah.
concluding question. I mean, what's your what's your general take on this conversation? Do you think it had value? Did it meet your expectations? Did it fall short? Like, what's your
We went for
conclusion?
about. I think you didn't. I don't know if you knew how long we went. You said 3.5. We've gone 4.5 hours.
Oh my goodness!
So this is much longer than I expected. It was.
Yeah.
it was not as heated as I expected, which is good. But I mean, this went as about as I thought it would probably go. I did expect you to take a hard stance against aid to Ukraine. That's the thing that's baffled me the most, because it's just I just can't wrap my head around having gone all the way to Poland to cover this and still not having an opinion on it.
Again, I mean, maybe I'm repeating myself. It's not that I don't have opinions or not that I don't have beliefs on the subject, right? It's just it doesn't kind of fit into that
let me be
that
clear.
box.
So when you make a decision or vote on something, right? When I supported Joe Biden for president, and I voted for him, right? I didn't vote for him under the idea that Joe Biden good, Donald Trump bad. I voted for Joe Biden under the idea that the priorities that I care about as an American, he cares about more and would prioritize more than Donald Trump. Whether it comes to decriminalization of marijuana, and he has done some small moves in that direction, whether it has to do with student loan debt relief. I'm a young guy, so it's not surprising that, that's a good thing for me. And foreign policy is a big priority for me. And so I don't like, when we paint the election of Trump versus Biden, I don't paint it as good versus evil. I paint it as like, this is the best option available. And so I don't want you to say that aid to Ukraine is amazing in every way and it's the perfect option. What I would want is like, well, after looking at all the factors, I think this is the best case scenario is we send the aid, or the best case scenario, even if it sucks, is we don't send the aid. That's what I'm more looking for, instead of like some moral statement from you virtue signaling on how great of a person you are. It's more like your personal beliefs. If you were in this situation and you had a decision, what would be the scenario, this path you choose? Not a moral endorsement of everything that comes with it, but what is the path you would choose once put in the scenario? That's why I asked you the question, because I would believe you'd probably make the decision against the aid.
Well, actually, it's a good analog, and one that I hadn't really considered before. But now that you raise it, I think it actually is relevant, because a reason why, everybody has different reasons for whether for why they exercise their franchise, or whether they decline to, or maybe they're just totally apathetic, right? People have different reasonings for why they vote the way they do, or not. And maybe a bit differently from you, I actually do conceive of my vote as, even if it's like some subconscious, or even if I'm not fully conscious of this being the significance of the vote, I do feel if I'm affirmatively voting for a candidate, I am giving a imprimatur to that candidate. Like, for other words, I don't accept a common calculus about voting preference where you're just making a utilitarian 51 versus 49, or even 80 versus 20 judgment about who's more desirable given the choices at hand. No, I actually I view it a little bit differently. I actually do think of it more as like an affirmative endorsement of the candidate. Not that I'm not saying everybody looks at voting that way. I just think in terms of how I think about it, how it affects my own mental processes is, because like I did vote for Obama, right? I mean, I was a volunteer for Obama, very, almost ludicrously committed one, registered, lots of voters and stuff. And, I think I'd be kidding myself if I didn't acknowledge that in having voted for Obama and having personally invested in Obama's victory and success as president, that shaped how I viewed political events. Like I viewed political events, especially Obama's first term, before I was a journalist, and maybe even slightly after, in the most favorable possible light for Obama, because I felt I had invested in those outcomes in terms of my own, not just voting behavior, but activist or volunteer behavior. And so I do think there's, and so when I declined to vote in subsequent elections, It's not that I would rule out ever voting if I thought it was warranted to make that affirmative judgment that then binds me to the candidate, at least in this indirect sense. But I do think that, if I'm not willing to give that kind of more thoroughgoing endorsement than maybe you see your vote as doing, then I'm just going to decline and detach and conscientiously abstain, not out of apathy, but out of engagement with the political process. My choice is to conscientiously abstain. And I do think it's relevant for the Ukraine issue in that if I were to give you like the normative judgment that you're requesting me to make, it then kind of like binds me mentally to certain outcomes that I don't want to bind myself to because I'm not generally not invested in them, right? Because like I don't know. I mean,
that I guess
I don't want to be bound one way or another to whether Ukraine receives aid as appropriated by Congress, right? I want to just evaluate as best I can the implications and the significance of that happening or not happening, right? So I guess maybe I do ascribe to I do subscribe to a certain like maybe journalistic ethos almost as a
has donated $10.
guiding factor in my
emotional damage to me with that
political orientation where I am more disposed than maybe others to detach from the normative conflicts in terms of like, is this good or bad, or is this worth endorsing or not, or supporting or not? Because I feel like I'm that enables me to better evaluate as impartially as possible, not as like an objective observer who has no opinions on things, but someone who's again like detaching from that dimension of the debate so as to do the kind of analysis and reporting that I tend to want to do. Maybe people don't think
can I just say it like
justified, but that's how I think about it.
I guess like this kind of feels like, let's say you were hungry and I was like, oh man, if you were hungry, would you rather have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich or like a ham and cheese sandwich? And you're like, well, I don't want to like morally prescribe myself to tomatoes because I really don't like tomatoes, and peanut butter kind of gets stuck on the roof of my mouth, so I just refuse to make a decision. And it's like, well, I mean, one of these things are obviously going to be better for you if you like did the moral calculus, like one of them. So if you had to, but I don't want to morally tie myself. That's why it feels slippery. It feels like you could use this to defend not answering any question if there was even the slightest disagreement you had with one of the things being affirmative or not affirmative. And
choosing peanut butter and jelly over ham doesn't invest me in any highly fraught moral considerations, or it doesn't alter my
that's a
mental
question
processes such that I'm now invested in peanut butter over the ham, right? So I mean, I have to I have to question Michael, the aptness of that analogy.
I would also say that like you are already pretty invested in the outcome of this war in some capacity.
Absolutely.
You've went to Poland, you've covered the war. People have opinions because of what you've said about the war. There's people who probably believe things about the war because you said them to them, either on Twitter or in one of your Substack articles, and that affected whether or not they're going to support aid or not support aid. And so if the problem is, well, I'm going to personally invest myself in one way or the other, by you talking about it so much and covering it so much, you are having much more personal and just general investment in this conflict than anybody who would individually say yes or no to this question. In fact, I would say you've had more of an impact on the war than the average person through your coverage. And so this idea of like removing your personal attachment to the either yes or no to this question when you've already probably had not necessarily like an immense amount of influence, but some influence over the public perception of this war, I don't understand it. It seems that you're already invested in this war.
I'm invested in doing what I can to the best of my ability to use my faculties of reasoning and analysis and journalism and to critically but rationally and empirically cover the policy. That's what I actually am invested in. And I'm sorry, but I do have to conceptually distinguish that between from being invested in the normative question of yay or nay on the aid.
If I said, should Joe Biden bomb Moscow? Yes or no? What would your answer be to that question? My answer is no.
I guess I would. I mean, maybe here's a better way of putting it. Okay.
Really? Come on, that was so easy.
No. Hold on. Let me just answer it this way. Okay. Here's where I will give a direct answer, I think, of the kind that you're trying to extract from me. Do I support provision of aid to Ukraine? The answer is no. Okay. I do not actively support that. I'm not proactively supporting it, just as I'm not proactively supporting Biden over Trump or Trump over Biden. That is not one of my affirmative convictions. So, yeah, maybe a better way of putting it, and maybe a way that kind of gets more to what you're trying to drill down on here, is that when presented with that yes or no question, am I prepared to declare support for sending aid to Ukraine? The answer to that question is no. Okay, but it's a subtle but important distinction, because it kind of it bypasses this sort of trap of these narrow normative judgments that people always seem to want to lapse into, like in terms of is it good or bad, or do you support in terms of like assigning a normative value to the aid. All I can say is that if you were to ask me, do I actively, proactively support it on an affirmative level, the answer is no. Now, I don't know if that suffices, or you think that's additional slipperiness, but that's about the best I can do.
It's a little wiggly, but I'll let it pass. Now, but this also gives us a basis for, if we were to have another conversation, which I would love to pursue with you if you're interested, we could start from there. Because there's a disagreement, because I disagree with that statement wholeheartedly. I think we should all be proactively supporting aid to Ukraine. But that allows us to wrap up this conclusion.
That's helpful. I mean, I'm actually glad you pressed me on it, because I think that is a more useful way of reformulating the question. So I'm hopefully not coming across as slippery, but I'm answering. But yet it's still kind of elucidates.
That'll be up to the viewers to decide. I can't control that. But man, I appreciate talking to you. I followed you on Twitter. Hopefully we can have more conversations like this in the future. Probably not this long, but at least we were able to keep each other's interests for so long. Hey, that's a good sign.
Well, if there's one thing I can do, it's gab for extended periods of time. Are you going to? Is this going to go on YouTube or probably, someplace else where I can like access it?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, almost certainly.
Okay.
It'll probably be like in two separate chunks, because this is a massive conversation. But yeah.
Okay. All right.
I'll send it to you once it's up.
I mean,
but of course, it's gonna have like the title, like debating Michael Tracey. It's gonna have like that whole shebang.
Yeah.
I'll maybe give you. I'll give you like devil horns and like a flamethrower near a little Ukrainian village. I'll make it perfect. Don't worry.
Yeah, you totally destroyed me in all caps. Anyway, I just want to say quickly that I genuinely, and maybe this is just like a feature of my own strange personality, but in journalistic context and in non-journalistic context, or in like public media contexts or not, but let's just go with public media context for now. I have made a point for years to actively seek out people who disagree with me to have reasoned dialogue. Okay. A lot of people think that I have these sinister motives, or that I can't defend my positions or really engage with anybody on a reasonable, rational level. I try to do that to the best of my ability, especially when there are seemingly stark differences of viewpoints. So I appreciate you inviting me. I didn't know exactly what to make of it when you first invited me, because I just wasn't
thought I was a troll.
too familiar with you. But it turned out to be, I think, pretty exemplary in terms of it being a constructive conversation, cordial, respectful. Again, I do have a bad habit of interrupting.
Do you feel like I trapped you in any way, or was this?
No, not at all. Not at all.